She had the whole sidewalk laughing. A polished CEO in a tailored suit standing outside her own firm, pointing at a rust-covered car and the quiet man who drove it, calling them both a waste of space. She didn't know his name. She didn't ask. That was the mistake that would follow her for the rest of her career. Because the car she mocked in front of a crowd of strangers, it was about to be declared one of the most significant automotive discoveries in modern history. And the man she humiliated? The world already knew exactly who he was. She just hadn't done her homework. If you want to know how this unfolds, stay until the end. Hit the like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Ethan Mercer drove into the city, he wasn't thinking about what anyone might say about his car. He almost never did. The old Datsun 240Z sat low on its suspension, the original copper-bronze paint so far beneath the rust and grime that you had to know it was there to believe it. One of the rear quarter panels had a long dent that ran like a scar from the wheel arch to the tail, and the passenger side mirror was held at its angle by a strip of electrical tape that had been there so long it had fused with the plastic. The car looked like something you'd see rotting at the end of a gravel driveway in a small town, the kind of vehicle people drove around rather than look at directly. Ethan drove it with both hands on the wheel, and the driver's window cracked about 2 inches, the way his father had always done. Old habit. The kind you don't think about until someone asks you why you do it, and then you can't explain it without explaining everything. In the passenger seat, Chloe had her face pressed against the glass and her sneakers pulled up onto the dashboard, which Ethan had asked her 3 times not to do and had now given up asking about. She was 9 years old and relentlessly curious about everything except the things her teachers wanted her to be curious about, and he'd been her de facto weekend companion since her parents, his older brother Marcus and Marcus's wife Dana, had started working weekends last spring to cover the mortgage on a house that had turned out to be slightly more than they could afford. Ethan didn't mind. Chloe was easy company. She asked good questions. She didn't fill silence just because it was there. "Is this the car Grandpa built?" she asked, without moving her face from the glass. "He didn't build it. He worked on it." "What's the difference?" Ethan thought about that for a moment. Building something means you started with nothing. Working on something means someone trusted you enough to hand it to you. Chloe considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. "Which one is harder?" "The second one," Ethan said. "Definitely the second one." She accepted that and went back to watching the city out the window. The science fair was at Eastfield Community Center, about 12 blocks from the financial district. Chloe's project was a model of the water cycle she'd built from a plastic storage container, a heat lamp, and a bag of aquarium gravel, and it had won second place at the school level, which meant she was now competing at the city qualifier. She was trying to act like she didn't care about winning, but she'd been up at 6:30 in the morning reorganizing her display cards, and she'd made Ethan stop twice on the way to check that the heat lamp was still secure in the back seat. He found parking on Mercer Avenue. He always noticed when streets shared his last name, though he'd long since stopped mentioning it out loud because nobody found it as interesting as he did. About a block and a half from the community center, the street had 2-hour meters and a stretch of commercial buildings on one side, a coffee shop, a dry cleaner, and the glass and steel corner building that housed Pinnacle Capital Partners, one of the more prominent investment firms in the state. Ethan had driven past it before. He didn't have any particular feelings about it. He parallel parked the Datsun in the space behind a Range Rover that cost roughly 40 times what he spent on rent each month, and then he helped Chloe carry her display board and lamp inside. He was back at the car 11 minutes later. He'd arranged to meet Chloe's parents there at noon, which gave him about 2 hours, and he'd brought a paperback with him, a used copy of a biography he'd been meaning to finish for 3 weeks, because he preferred to wait outside rather than sit in a gymnasium watching other people's children talk about compost. He was not a man who needed a lot of stimulation to feel content. He could sit with a book and a quiet street for hours without feeling like he was missing anything. He'd been reading for about 20 minutes when he heard the voice. Not at him, not yet. It was directed at someone else, a man in a gray coat who was apparently trying to cross the sidewalk without causing offense to anyone, which was proving difficult because the woman speaking seemed to find his mere existence an inconvenience. She was dressed in a way that announced itself. Charcoal blazer, ivory blouse, heels that looked expensive and impractical, her dark hair pulled back with the kind of precision that suggested either a stylist or a very particular set of personal standards. She was talking on her phone with one hand and gesturing at her driver with the other, and her voice carried the specific quality of someone who had been listened to long enough that they no longer thought about whether their volume was appropriate. "No, Marcus," she was saying, and then she stopped because her driver had opened the rear door of a black sedan that was idling at the curb, and in doing so had stepped slightly into the path of Ethan's car, and she'd finally noticed the Datsun sitting there in the parking space. Ethan looked up from his book. She was staring at the car with an expression he recognized. It happened occasionally, though more often in certain neighborhoods than others. The particular combination of amusement and disbelief that people wore when they saw something they felt should not exist in their immediate environment. "Hold on," she said into the phone and lowered it from her ear. There were 4 or 5 people nearby, a young guy in a jacket eating a sandwich outside the coffee shop, a couple with a stroller waiting at the crosswalk, 2 women in business attire who had just exited Pinnacle's lobby and were now standing near the entrance, evidently waiting for someone, and a man in his 50s with a camera bag who was either a tourist or a real estate photographer. Ethan couldn't tell which. "Is this yours?" the woman said. She was talking to him, not aggressively, not yet, more like she was trying to confirm something she already found funny. Ethan closed his book. "Yeah." She tilted her head slightly, took in the rust, the tape on the mirror, the sagging rear bumper where one of the mounts had given out the previous winter and he hadn't replaced it yet. "You drove this here?" she said. "Today? On purpose?" "I did," she laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, not entirely. It had that quality of something that surprised you out of you before you made a choice about it, but she also didn't try to stop it or walk it back. "I'm sorry," she said, not sounding particularly sorry. "I don't mean to. How does this thing even pass inspection?" The 2 women near the lobby entrance were watching now. The guy with the sandwich had turned. "It passes," Ethan said. "Barely," she said, and glanced at her driver who produced a small, careful smile. "I mean, look at it. I've seen better-looking cars at a demolition derby." She took a step toward the Datsun, studying the dented quarter panel with something between fascination and contempt. And the driver, she looked at him then, taking in his appearance with the same casual inventory. He was wearing work pants, worn brown boots, a flannel shirt that was clean but fraying at the left cuff. He'd shaved that morning, but not closely. His jacket was a canvas field coat that had been through about a decade of serious use. "You know you're parked outside one of the top investment firms in the state, right? Some of our clients park here." "I noticed," Ethan said. "Does it not bother you, looking like this, driving this thing?" She said it the way people ask questions they don't actually expect to be surprised by, like she'd already written the answer and was just waiting for him to confirm it. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at his book and opened it. "Huh." She seemed almost offended by that. "Okay." She said something else, something about how some people had no self-awareness, and it got a short laugh from the 2 women near the door. The man with the sandwich smiled into his cup. The couple with the stroller moved on, unbothered, and then her driver shut the car door for her, and the black sedan pulled into traffic, and it was over. Ethan sat there and read his book. He wasn't thinking about it 20 minutes later when he heard footsteps stop near his car. He assumed it was someone checking the parking meter on the Range Rover behind him, or someone waiting for a break in traffic. He didn't look up. "Excuse me." He looked up. The woman was younger than he'd initially registered, mid-30s maybe. She was carrying a tote bag with a notebook tucked under her arm, and she was wearing the kind of sensible office clothes that suggested she spent most of her days at a desk, but occasionally needed to look put together for meetings. Dark slacks, a pale blue top, a lanyard with a building keycard still clipped to her collar. She had the slightly hurried look of someone who had taken a short break and was already counting the minutes until she had to be back. "I saw what happened," she said. "With Ms. Sterling. I work here." She gestured toward the Pinnacle building. "I just wanted to... I don't know, I guess I just wanted to say that was not okay." "It was fine," Ethan said. "It wasn't." He considered arguing the point and decided against it. "She said what she thought. I've heard worse." The woman's eyes moved to the car and something shifted in her expression. Not the amusement that Vanessa Sterling had shown, but something different. Interest, almost. The kind of attention that focuses because it's trying to understand rather than to judge. "Can I ask about the car?" Ethan looked at her. "Why?" "My dad used to restore cars. Not anymore. He retired a few years ago. His hands got bad, but I grew up around them." She tilted her head, studying the roofline of the Datsun. "This is a 240Z. "It is." "What year?" 71. She nodded slowly. "My dad would want to know the production sequence." That surprised him. Not many people thought to ask about production sequence. "Early build," he said. "February of 71. She absorbed that in the way someone absorbs information they don't quite know what to do with yet. "Is that the original engine?" And here Ethan paused. Not because the question was out of bounds, but because it had a longer answer than a sidewalk conversation could properly contain. He glanced toward the hood, then back at her. "More or less," he said, which was the most honest short answer he had. Her brow furrowed slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means the answer is complicated." She opened her mouth to say something else, then thought better of it. She extended her hand. "Rachel Bennett. I'm an executive assistant upstairs." He shook it. "Ethan Mercer." She started to respond, and he watched the name go through her. That specific processing pause people did when a name triggered something they couldn't quite place. "Mercer," she said. "Why do I know that name?" "It's a common name." "No, I feel like I've read it somewhere. In my dad's newsletters or an industry publication." "I should let you get back to work," Ethan said. She looked at him, then at the car, then back at him, with the expression of someone who has the sense that something is sitting right in front of her that she can't quite see yet. "Can I take a photo? Of the car, I mean. I want to show my dad." Ethan shrugged. "It's a public street." She took 2 photos from different angles, looking particularly at the rear of the vehicle, and then, with visible deliberateness, walking around to look at the partially opened hood. Ethan had cracked it on the way into the city because the temperature gauge had run a little warm, and he wanted to let the engine breathe during the stop. She looked at the engine for a long moment. "Ethan," she said carefully, "I don't mean any disrespect, and I could be completely wrong, but this engine doesn't look like a standard L24. "It isn't," he said. "What is it?" He closed his book, looked out at the street for a moment, then looked back at her. "Like I said, the answer is complicated." Rachel Bennett stood there another few seconds, looking like someone trying to decide whether to ask the next question or let it go. She let it go. "Okay. Nice to meet you, Ethan." She started to turn. "I'm sorry again about Ms. Sterling." "You don't need to apologize for someone else." She looked back at him briefly. "No, I guess I don't." She crossed the sidewalk and went back inside. Ethan sat with his book and didn't read it. He thought about his father. He thought about how James Mercer had talked about that engine the way other men talked about their best year, with pride and distance and something that was almost grief, because you don't get more than one best year, and his had been spent on something that no one outside of a very small circle had ever known about. James had been a machinist and an engine builder, and for one remarkable stretch of 3 years in the early 1970s, a participant in one of the most quietly significant engineering programs in the history of Japanese automotive development. He'd come back from it with the car and a fabricated cover story about buying it at an estate sale. The car had been his, given to him. He never explained why. He said it wasn't important. He said the work was what mattered. Ethan had been 14 when his father first lifted the hood and showed him what was underneath. He still remembered the feeling of standing there, looking at that engine, while his father said very little and let the thing speak for itself. "It looks different," Ethan had said, because it did. "Yes," said James. "Why?" And James had told him, slowly, over years, in pieces, the way you only tell someone something you want them to carry carefully. The full story had taken most of Ethan's adolescence to assemble. He'd filled in the gaps himself later through research and careful conversations with people who had been there. By the time he was 25, he knew more about what was under the hood of that car than almost anyone alive. He'd verified it thoroughly. The provenance, the documentation, The engineering records his father had kept in a locked drawer that Ethan had found after the funeral. He'd had it authenticated quietly by two independent experts who signed confidentiality agreements before they looked at it. He knew exactly what he had. He also knew exactly what he intended to do with it, which was nothing. The car was his father's. It was his now. That was enough. He opened his book again and read 3 pages before Chloe came running out of the community center to tell him she'd won 3rd place, and could they please get lunch somewhere that had good French fries.
Vam.
They went to a diner 2 blocks east, and Chloe ate an unreasonable number of French fries and talked without stopping about a boy at her school named Devin, who had entered a project about aerodynamics, and whose model airplane had actually flown across the gymnasium and knocked over someone else's display, which Chloe considered the most spectacular thing she had ever witnessed in an educational setting. Should he get points taken off? She asked, because it was technically an accident. Was the project supposed to demonstrate aerodynamics? Yeah. And it flew across the gymnasium. Really far. Sounds like it worked. Chloe thought about that. That's a good point. She dipped a fry in ketchup and pointed it at him. Do you think the lady from this morning felt bad about what she said? Ethan looked up from his coffee. What lady? The one outside the building. I saw from the sidewalk. I was coming out to get you because they were having trouble with the extension cord, and I saw her making fun of Dad's car. He was quiet for a moment. You shouldn't call it Dad's car. It's mine now. You know what I mean? Chloe was watching him in that direct, uncomplicated way kids had before they learned to look away from things. Did it bother you? No. You're not just saying that? I'm not just saying that. She absorbed this with some skepticism. I think it would bother me. Maybe when you're older it won't. Or maybe you've just had a lot of practice, she said. Ethan looked at his niece. She was 9 years old and she was absolutely right, but he wasn't going to say so over French fries in a diner booth. He paid the check, helped her carry her display board back to the car, and drove them both out of the city by 2 in the afternoon. The Datsun rode rough on the highway. It always had. The suspension was original, and the road noise came up through the floor in a particular way that Ethan had long since stopped noticing, except on very long drives. He kept both hands on the wheel, and the window cracked 2 inches, and the city fell away behind them. Rachel Bennett sat at her desk on the 14th floor of Pinnacle Capital Partners and looked at the 2 photographs on her phone. She'd sent them to her father an hour ago. He hadn't responded yet, which either meant he was napping. He napped a lot now since the arthritis in his hands had gotten bad enough that he'd had to stop working, or he was looking very carefully at what she'd sent him and thinking about it. Her father was Thomas Bennett. He had spent 30 years as one of the most respected restoration consultants in the country, specializing in post-war Japanese and European sports cars. He had authenticated vehicles for museums, for insurance companies, for private collectors with the kind of net worth that required separate legal teams to manage. He had retired 4 years ago at 68 and spent most of his time now reading, tending a garden that he'd become obsessively serious about, and occasionally writing articles for 2 small automotive journals that he'd been contributing to since the 1980s. He called her back at 4:15. Rachel. His voice had that quality it got when he was being careful with something. Where did you take these pictures? Outside my office. A man was parked on the street. What man? His name was Ethan Mercer. Silence. Dad? Say that again. Ethan Mercer. He said it was his car. Another silence, longer. Rachel, I need you to look at the second photo again, the one of the engine bay. She pulled it up. She'd taken it at an angle, not close enough. She'd been trying not to be obvious about it. But you could see the general configuration of the engine, the unusual intake placement, the casting marks on the block. Okay, I'm looking at it. Do you see the intake manifold? Yes. That is not a production casting. I know. He told me it wasn't a standard L24. Rachel. Her father's voice had gone very quiet. If that is what I think it might be, and I am not saying it is, because I am looking at a photograph taken from 15 feet away on a phone camera. But if it is what it might be, then the car that woman was mocking this morning is one of the most significant vehicles anyone has encountered in the last 20 years. Rachel sat very still at her desk. Through the glass partition, she could see the trading floor humming along in the middle distance, and beyond that, the window looking out over the city and the gray afternoon sky. "What do you think it is?" "I think," he said slowly, "that you need to find Ethan Mercer and ask if your old father can take a better look at that engine." He didn't seem like someone who wanted a lot of questions. "No," Thomas said. "Men who have something that valuable rarely do. That's usually how you know they actually understand what they have." She looked at the photo again. "Dad, who is he? When I said his name, you went quiet." "Ethan Mercer," Thomas said, "is probably the most respected independent vehicle appraiser working today. I know 3 collectors in Europe who will not authenticate a significant acquisition without his involvement. He worked with the Peterson on their archive review 6 years ago. He testified in 2 federal cases involving disputed provenance claims. He is, by most serious accounts, one of the most knowledgeable people alive on post-war Japanese automobiles." A pause. "And he was parked on your street in that car, and a woman from your office made fun of him for it." Rachel closed her eyes briefly. "That was Vanessa Sterling. She's our CEO. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then, "Well, yeah. I hope someone filmed it." Rachel thought about the man with the camera bag who'd been standing on the sidewalk. She thought about the 2 women from the office who'd laughed. She thought about the entire small, embarrassing theater of it. Vanessa Sterling at full performance, the crowd of accidental witnesses, and Ethan Mercer sitting there with his paperback not giving a single visible sign that any of it touched him. "I need to find him again," she said. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "You probably do. And Rachel, be respectful about it. Men like Ethan Mercer are not difficult to offend, but they are very, very difficult to impress. And if he decides you're not worth his time, no amount of asking will change that." After she hung up, Rachel sat at her desk for a while and thought about the way Ethan Mercer had looked at her when she'd mentioned the engine. Not defensive, not guarded, not worried about what she might know or figure out. Just steady and patient and entirely prepared to wait her out. Like a man who had been waiting a very long time and had decided it was fine. Finding him took less effort than she expected. She went home that evening and spent an hour on the phone with her father, who dictated to her a short list of industry contacts and publications that would likely have Ethan Mercer in their records. She started with an independent appraisal registry that Thomas had worked with for years, and the name was there in the public directory with a contact address, a post office box in a town about 2 hours outside the city, and an email address that looked like it had been created sometime around 2007 and never updated. She wrote him an email that she rewrote 4 times before sending. She introduced herself, explained where they'd met, and said that her father, Thomas Bennett, was interested in discussing the vehicle and would appreciate any opportunity to take a closer look. She kept it short. She didn't explain everything she and her father suspected because she thought a man like Ethan Mercer would find that presumptuous. She hit send and went to bed and lay awake longer than she should have, thinking about the look on his face when he'd said the answer is complicated. His reply came at 6:40 the next morning. 4 sentences. "Rachel, I remember you. Give Thomas my regards. I'm familiar with his work. If he wants to take a look, I'm in town most Saturdays. Have him reach out directly." She read it twice. Then she forwarded it to her father with the subject line. He said yes. Bochum. Back on the street where it had all started, Vanessa Sterling was in her 14th meeting of the day and was not thinking about the man with the rust-covered car or the comment she'd made about him. It had been a small thing, a throwaway moment on her way into the building, the kind of thing that came out when she was on the phone and not paying full attention. She didn't consider it something she needed to think further about. She ran a $200 million investment portfolio. She had 3 partnerships under active negotiation, a board presentation in 11 days, and a charity gala in 6 that she was co-chairing for the 2nd consecutive year. She had priorities. She also had, somewhere in the back of her mind, the specific texture of the way the man had looked at her when she'd finished talking. Not anger, not shame. Something quieter and more final, like someone who had already decided something and wasn't going to spend any more time on it. She didn't like that feeling. She hadn't thought about it until now, and now that she was thinking about it, she pushed it aside. She had work to do. But at 7 that evening, when she was riding the elevator down to the parking structure, and her assistant Elena mentioned that Rachel Bennett had taken a long lunch and was seen photographing a car parked out front, Vanessa paused with her hand on the elevator button. "Which car?" she asked. Elena shrugged. I don't know. One of the streetcars, I think. Vanessa said nothing. She rode the elevator down and got into her car and drove home through the early dark. The man's face was still sitting there in the back of her mind when she went to sleep. The following Saturday, Thomas Bennett drove 2 hours to meet a man he'd been professionally aware of for nearly a decade. They shook hands in the gravel lot outside a storage facility on the edge of town where Ethan kept the car during the week. Thomas was 69 years old, thick through the shoulders, with hands that were visibly arthritic now, but still moved with the muscle memory of a man who had spent decades doing precise and careful work. He looked at the Datsun for a long time before he said anything. Then he said, "May I?" "Go ahead," Ethan said. Thomas walked slowly around the car. He crouched at the rear to look at the chassis stamp. He ran his fingers along the edge of the hood without opening it yet. He looked at the door sills and the frame rails and the firewall through the windscreen. Rachel stood off to one side, watching both men, saying nothing. Finally, Thomas straightened up and looked at Ethan. "The hood?" Ethan reached in through the driver's window and pulled the hood release. The latch popped, and Thomas lifted it and propped it, and then he stood over the engine bay and was quiet for a very long time. "Where did you get this car?" he asked at last. "My father," Ethan said. "He passed 12 years ago." "And he—" Thomas stopped, recalibrated. "What do you know about the engine?" "Everything," Ethan said. Thomas looked at him. Then he looked back at the engine. "The P-76 program," he said softly. Not a question. And Ethan said nothing, which was the same as saying yes. Thomas Bennett stood with his arthritic hands hovering over an engine block that he had spent 20 years hearing referenced obliquely in technical journals and the private conversations of old engineers that had been described as a lost chapter in the story of Japanese performance engineering, that 3 separate experts he respected had concluded no longer existed in any drivable form. "You've had this the whole time," Thomas said. It was barely a statement. "My father had it," Ethan said. "Now I do." Thomas turned. His face was very still, but his eyes had the brightness of a man for whom something just clicked into a position it had been approaching for a long time. "Do you know what this is worth?" "Yes," Ethan said. "I know exactly what it's worth." And the way he said it made it clear he wasn't talking about money. Rachel was watching her father's face, and her father was looking at Ethan Mercer, and the afternoon light was flat and gray over the gravel lot, and no one said anything else for a while. The Datsun sat there, rust-covered and patient, exactly as it had always been, waiting for the world to catch up. Thomas Bennett didn't sleep well that night. Rachel knew because he called her at 11:15, which he hadn't done since she was in college, and going through a rough stretch with a boyfriend he'd never trusted. Back then he'd called to say he was thinking about her. This time he called to talk about an engine. "I keep going back to the casting marks," he said, and she could hear him pacing, which meant he was in the kitchen because the kitchen was the only room in his house with enough clear floor space to pace properly. "The intake manifold configuration is wrong for any production L-series variant I've ever documented. And the combustion chamber geometry. Rachel, I only got a few minutes with it, but the geometry looked like a pre-production specification." "Dad, it's late." "I know it's late. I can't stop thinking about it." She sat up in bed and pushed her hair back. "What exactly is the P-76 program?" He paused, and she heard him pull out a chair at the kitchen table. The pacing was done. This was going to take a while. In the early 1970s, there was a very small internal engineering project at one of the major Japanese manufacturers. I'm not going to name them because I'm not certain enough yet, and I will not start rumors. And the project was focused on a high-output variation of their production inline 6 for potential motorsport applications. Not Formula One, not Le Mans, something more specific. A rally-adjacent program that never fully materialized because the fuel crisis in '73 killed the budget and the appetite for it simultaneously. And the P-76 was part of that. The P-76 was the engine designation. Most people who've tried to trace it hit a wall around 1974 because the program's records were either consolidated into general engineering archives or, but more likely, deliberately separated from the main documentation to protect the intellectual property once the program was shut down. There are references to it in 3 technical papers from the period, passing references. Nobody writes about it directly because nobody has been able to physically examine a confirmed example. He stopped. Until potentially now. Rachel was quiet for a moment. How rare is rare? I spoke with a colleague in Munich about 5 years ago. A man who spent 15 years tracing the provenance of a specific Porsche development engine. He told me the P76 was the Japanese equivalent of that kind of unicorn. Theoretically documented, practically invisible. He said he believed at most 3 examples were ever completed, and none were known to have survived in anything close to original condition. Ethan's is in running condition. Thomas went quiet in a way that meant he was sitting with something. Dad. I know, he said. I know. A long exhale. If that engine is genuine, and I want to be clear that I need far more time with it, and I would want at least one other expert present. If it's genuine, what's under that hood is not just a rare engine. It is a documented piece of engineering history from a program that shaped the architecture of every high-performance Japanese engine built in the following decade. The engineers who worked on it went on to influence entire generations of powertrain development. The P76 is the thing that came before the thing everyone knows about. Rachel sat in her dark bedroom and thought about the man on the sidewalk. The worn boots, the fraying cuff, the patience of someone who had made a decision so long ago that the decision had become simply the way things were. He knows, doesn't he? He knows exactly what he has. He told us he knows everything about the engine. He wasn't bragging. No, Thomas agreed. He was not. She lay back down after they hung up and looked at the ceiling. She thought about Vanessa Sterling's voice carrying across the sidewalk, polished and certain, and aimed at a man who could have ended the joke in about 30 seconds with a single sentence. He'd chosen not to. She thought about that choice and what it said about him, and then she thought about what it said about her employer, and she slept badly for what remained of the night. Monday morning came with the particular sharpness of a day that wants something from you. Rachel was at her desk by 8, which was 20 minutes earlier than usual, and she spent those 20 minutes doing something she rarely did, which was searching Ethan Mercer's professional history with the deliberate attention of someone building a case. She'd started the night before, picking through automotive industry publications, appraisal registries, legal databases, and the archived newsletters her father had been sending her for years, and that she'd mostly only skimmed. What she assembled over the course of those searches was not a profile exactly. Ethan Mercer did not maintain a professional website, did not appear to have any social media presence that she could locate, and had given what appeared to be exactly one published interview in a small trade journal from 2014, which she found in a digital archive and read 3 times. But around the edges of his visible absence, the shape of his work was unmistakable. The Peterson Museum engagement her father had mentioned was documented in the museum's own records. A year-long consultation to verify the provenance and condition grading of 47 vehicles in their permanent collection, a project that had apparently resulted in 3 significant reassessments and 1 outright declassification of a vehicle that had been publicly described as authentic for 11 years. The declassification had been reported without naming Ethan specifically, but the appraisal credit was listed in the museum's technical footnotes, and her father confirmed who it was. There were 2 federal court cases. The first involved a disputed insurance claim on a vehicle that had been presented as a matching numbers example of a rare post-war Japanese sports car. The second involved an estate dispute in which the value of 3 vehicles was in question, and both parties had eventually agreed on a single independent appraiser whose assessment would be binding. In both cases, Ethan's name appeared in the public record in the measured, context-free way that expert witnesses appeared, present, credible, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. She found references to him in the private correspondence sections of 2 collector journals, not letters he'd written, but letters other people had written referencing his assessments. One, from a German collector writing about the authentication of a 1970 Nissan Skyline GTR, described Mercer as the man you call when you want to know the truth, even if you're not sure you want to hear it. Another, from an anonymous American collector, described turning to Ethan after 2 other appraisers had given him conflicting assessments on a vehicle acquisition. Mercer looked at it for 4 hours and wrote a 6-page report that made the other 2 look like they'd done their evaluations from a moving car. She found one more thing, and this was the one that stayed with her through the morning. In a small industry newsletter from 2018, there was a brief article about the estate of a collector in Connecticut who had died leaving a collection of 31 vehicles. The estate had been contested between two branches of the family, and during the process, a vehicle that had been cataloged by a previous appraiser as a 1969 replica had been re-examined and found to be a genuine example of a type that had been thought entirely extinct. The discovery had added nearly $400,000 to the estate's value. The appraiser credited with the reassessment was listed as E. Mercer, independent. Rachel put her phone down and looked out the window at the street 14 floors below, at the parking spaces along the curb where an ordinary Tuesday had apparently been parked 18 months before she'd taken that photograph, and thought about the specific mechanics of what Vanessa Sterling had done, not maliciously. That was what made it stick. Not out of cruelty with intent, out of a fast, unconsidered read of visible surface information, applied by someone who trusted her own instincts so thoroughly that she no longer thought to examine them. It was the kind of mistake that felt very small from the inside and looked very large from the outside, and Rachel had been working for Vanessa long enough to know that this was not an isolated tendency. She also knew that Vanessa Sterling was not, underneath the armor of her professional self, a person without conscience. She had seen evidence of that conscience on a handful of occasions over the years, moments where the performance slipped and something more genuine showed through. The problem was those moments were increasingly rare, and Vanessa herself didn't seem to notice when they disappeared. That afternoon, when Vanessa swept through the office on her way back from a lunch meeting with a partner from their Chicago portfolio, she stopped at Rachel's desk in the way that meant she wanted something but hadn't decided how to ask for it yet. "The car on the street last week," Vanessa said without preamble. Rachel looked up. "Yes?" "You photographed it." "I did." Vanessa held her gaze in that particular way she had, slightly too long, that she'd probably practiced to seem authoritative and had now made habit. "Why?" Rachel considered the various accurate answers she could give and chose the least revealing one. "My father restores cars. The engine looked unusual. I wanted to show him." "And?" "And he thought it was interesting." Vanessa waited for more. Rachel didn't give more. After a beat, Vanessa said, "The man who was parked there, do you know who he was?" We introduced ourselves. "And?" "His name was Ethan Mercer." Nothing crossed Vanessa's face in any obvious way. She wasn't a person who let things cross her face in obvious ways. But there was a fractional pause, the kind that happened when someone was processing a name and coming up empty, and Rachel could see it before Vanessa's expression smoothed back out. "Should I know that name?" Rachel held the pause for exactly one beat too long on purpose. Then she said, "I wouldn't know, Ms. Sterling. Was there something you needed?" Vanessa looked at her for a moment, then redirected, which was what she did when conversations weren't going the direction she'd intended. She asked about the Thursday afternoon schedule and walked back to her office without saying anything further about the car or the man who'd been sitting in it. Thomas drove out to see Ethan again the following Saturday, this time alone. Rachel had offered to come, and he told her he thought the first real conversation should be between the two of them. "Why?" she'd asked. "Because," her father had said, "I want him to know I'm coming because I'm interested, not because I work for someone who embarrassed him." She thought that was probably right. She spent that Saturday afternoon in her apartment doing laundry and trying not to think about what they were talking about. She managed until about 2 o'clock, at which point she gave up pretending she was interested in laundry and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and went deeper into the technical literature her father had recommended. What she found, spread across a handful of academic papers, technical retrospectives, and one extremely detailed forum thread on a collector's website that ran to over 200 pages, was the story of the P-76 program in the form that history had preserved it. Incomplete, partial, assembled from inference and the memories of engineers who had mostly retired or died before anyone thought to ask them the right questions. The program had started in 1969, she learned, as a response to the growing presence of European manufacturers in international rally competition. Japanese automakers had proven their reliability and fuel efficiency through the grueling East African Safari Rally and similar endurance events, but there was increasing interest in whether that engineering foundation could support higher output, higher revving power plant development. The P-76 project. She found the designation referenced in 2 papers, always briefly, always with the caveat that surviving documentation was limited, had been an attempt to answer that question with a specific engine architecture that prioritized sustained high RPM output without sacrificing the mechanical durability that was already a hallmark of the production units. The project had run from approximately 1969 to 1973. It was terminated, as her father had said, by the fuel crisis. The official engineering records had been absorbed into a general archive. The engineers dispersed. Some retired. Some moved to other programs. A few went on to influential positions elsewhere and left behind, in their later interviews and retrospective essays, brief and sometimes cryptic references to the work they'd done in the early 70s that they clearly couldn't fully discuss. And the engines, the handful of physical examples that had been built, were simply gone. Returned, scrapped, dispersed. Nobody knew for certain. The forum thread devoted 40 pages to attempts to track them. It concluded, with the defeated certainty of people who had been searching for a long time, that none were known to exist. None were known to exist. Rachel closed her laptop and sat at her kitchen table and thought about Ethan Mercer reading a paperback novel in a rust-covered car while a woman in a tailored blazer told a crowd of strangers that he didn't belong there. Her father called at 4:30. "How did it go?" she asked. He took a moment. "He let me measure the combustion chambers." "And?" "They matched the pre-production specifications from the 1971 technical correspondence I have on file." "Exactly. Not approximately. Exactly." Another pause. "He has the original manufacturing documentation, Rachel. His father kept every piece of paper. Assembly notations, materials certifications, a handwritten letter from the lead engineer on the project explaining how the engine came to leave the facility. It's all there. He kept it in a fireproof box in a storage unit for 12 years. She was quiet. "I asked him how long he'd known," Thomas continued. "He said his father showed him the engine when he was 14. He said he'd spent his entire career learning enough to understand what he was looking at. And the authentication? I told him I'd want a second opinion, not because I doubt what I saw, but because something like this needs more than one set of eyes. He said he knew that and that it was fine. He's had it independently assessed twice already. Both assessments were sealed. He has the reports." Thomas's voice had a particular quality, the tone of a man who has found something that confirms a belief he's held without ever having been able to prove it. He wasn't keeping this hidden. He was keeping it safe. There's a difference. Has he ever considered selling it? I asked him that. What did he say? Her father was quiet for a moment. He said, "To whom?" And then he said, "My father didn't bring it home so it could end up behind glass somewhere." I think that was his answer. Rachel sat with that for a while after they hung up. Outside her apartment window, the afternoon was going gray, the way late autumn afternoons in this city went gray early and with conviction. And she watched the light change and thought about what it meant to know the value of something and carry that knowledge without it changing who you were. She had been an executive assistant for 9 years. She had watched Vanessa Sterling build a career on the premise that visible success was the most reliable indicator of internal worth. She had absorbed that premise herself, more than she'd realized, and the encounter with Ethan Mercer and the long week of research that followed, it had done something to the way she was holding that premise. Something had loosened. 3 weeks after Thomas's second visit, the Heartfelt Collector Forum announced its annual autumn showcase, scheduled for the following month at the Heartfelt Convention Center 40 minutes outside the city. The forum was one of the more prestigious collector events in the region, not the largest, but well attended by serious buyers and international figures in the collector community, and covered adequately by both automotive press and, increasingly, by general interest journalists drawn by the escalating valuations in the collector market. Rachel saw the announcement in a newsletter and mentioned it to her father. "I know," Thomas said. "Alessandro Ricci will be there." She didn't immediately recognize the name. "Who is that?" "A collector, Italian, based in Milan now. He's been in the field since the 1980s. He was involved in the early cataloging of a significant Japanese collection in Turin about 15 years ago, and he's been one of the foremost authorities on post-war Japanese performance vehicles since about 2005. Thomas paused. He also spent 3 years in the 1990s trying to locate surviving examples of the P-76 program. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Does he know about Ethan's car? Nobody knows about the car. That's the point. She looked at the announcement on her screen. The showcase was open to exhibitors and to ticketed attendees. She was already doing the math. Do you think Ethan would bring it? I don't know. I think you'd have to ask him. You know him better now. Rachel. Her father's voice had the patient tone he used when he thought she was looking for a shortcut. This is not my decision to make, or yours. The car belongs to the man. His reasons for keeping it private are legitimate. If he wants to bring it to an event like Heartfelt, he'll make that decision on his own terms. She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. I know. That said, Thomas added in a different tone, I did mention the event to him last week, casually. And? He said he'd heard about it. That's all? That's all he said to me. A brief pause. But he asked whether I thought Ricci would be attending, which suggests he already knew about Alessandro's work on the P-76 documentation. Of course he did, Rachel thought. The man had spent his entire adult life building the knowledge to understand what was in his storage unit. He would know every published reference, every collector who had gone looking, every corner of the documented history. He would know Alessandro Ricci's work as well as he knew the specifications of the engine. The question wasn't whether Ethan knew. The question was what he was deciding. Vanessa Sterling had by this point largely moved on, or believed she had. The incident on the sidewalk had receded into the background hum of a week, then 2 weeks, then a month of consecutive busy days that left no room for idle reflection. She had completed her board presentation. The charity gala had gone well. She'd been photographed with 4 people whose names she could use in conversation for the next 6 months, which was the practical measure by which she evaluated those events. 2 of the 3 partnership negotiations were progressing, but Rachel was different in a way she couldn't pinpoint, not less capable. Her work was as good as it had ever been, sometimes better, not less professional. But there was something in the way she answered certain questions that had changed, a quality of consideration that hadn't been there before, or that hadn't been visible before. Vanessa noticed it in the same way you notice a piece of furniture that's been moved 2 inches. Not obviously wrong, but not quite where you expected it. She mentioned it to her friend Diane over drinks on a Thursday evening. Diane was a partner at a law firm downtown and had known Vanessa since business school and was one of approximately 2 people in her life who could be trusted to give her an honest read. My EA has been slightly off, Vanessa said. Diane looked at her over her glass. Off how? Not in her work, just in the way she talks to me. Like she's seen something I'm not. That sounds like a personal problem, Diane said. It started around the time of the thing with the car. What car? Vanessa had told this story once already, briefly, to a colleague at a partner lunch, and that telling had produced exactly the reaction she'd expected. Mild amusement, quick agreement that some people simply defied the principle of situational awareness. This telling felt different even before she'd finished. Diane was listening with that particular expression she had when she was receiving information and had already separated what she thought from what she was going to say about it. Let me ask you something, Diane said when Vanessa finished. Go ahead. How do you know the car was worthless? Vanessa looked at her. It was covered in rust. The bumper was falling off. It looked like it had been in storage since the 80s. You didn't answer the question. Vanessa stopped. The gin and tonic was cold in her hand, and the bar noise was a low, agreeable murmur around them, and she was sitting with Diane's question in a way she hadn't expected to sit with anything this evening. I assumed. You assumed. Based on everything visible. Based on the appearance, Diane said, not unkindly, but without any cushioning either. Which is something you do. Vanessa looked at her. Everyone does it? Sure. But not everyone says it out loud on a public sidewalk while people watch. Diane set her glass down. What was his name? The guy with the car? I don't actually know. Diane raised an eyebrow. I didn't ask. There was a pause that said more than either of them chose to say out loud. Then Diane picked her drink back up and said, How much do you want to know? I already know I was rude. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking how much you want to know. About who he is, what the car was, whether your read was right. Vanessa was quiet. Because there are two versions of this, Diane said. One is you were rude to an ordinary person, which still makes you rude, but it's contained. The other is you were rude to someone in front of an audience and your assumptions were wrong, which is a different kind of thing entirely. She looked at Vanessa steadily. I think you already know which version it is. I think that's why your EA is looking at you differently. Vanessa said nothing for a moment. The bar noise continued around them, indifferent. She took a sip of her drink. How do I find out who he was? Ask your EA, Diane said. She already knows. Rachel was not surprised when Vanessa stopped at her desk first thing Friday morning and said, Tell me about Ethan Mercer. She told her, not everything, and not in the tone of someone delivering a verdict. She tried to be straightforward about it, which took some effort because she had private feelings about the situation that she was not Vanessa's confessor. She covered the professional history the way she'd tell anyone. The museum work, the federal consultations, the reputation among collectors. She said that her father, Thomas Bennett, had examined the vehicle and believed the engine to be an extraordinarily significant historical find. Vanessa listened to all of it without interrupting, which was unusual. When Rachel finished, Vanessa said, You've known this for how long? A few weeks. Another silence. Vanessa's expression did that thing it very rarely did, which was go briefly unguarded. And in that unguarded moment, she looked less like a CEO and more like someone who was trying to figure out how to carry something that is heavier than it looked. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Rachel held her gaze. It didn't seem like information you'd asked for. It was not unkind, but it was not gentle either. Vanessa recognized this kind of answer. She'd given a version of it herself, to people who'd asked questions she felt they weren't entitled to yet. Having it delivered back to her was a different sensation entirely. She went back to her office and closed the door, which she rarely did before noon, and Rachel watched the closed door for a moment before she returned to her work. An hour later, Vanessa's intercom clicked. Rachel, find out if the Heartfelt Collector Forum has corporate sponsorship packages available. Rachel looked at her phone, looked at the wall, looked back at the phone. Then she typed the inquiry. The email Ethan Mercer received on a Tuesday evening in mid-November was from Thomas Bennett and contained, near the end, a sentence that he read twice. Vanessa Sterling's firm, Pinnacle Capital Partners, has taken a corporate table at the Heartfelt event. I don't know what her intentions are, and I'm not suggesting it should affect your decision one way or another. I thought you should know. Ethan read the email at the kitchen table of his rental house with a cup of coffee going cold beside his laptop. The house was small and drafty, and most of the furniture was secondhand, which suited him fine. He had a particular relationship with objects that most people didn't share, a sense that value wasn't located in surfaces, and the house reflected that in the same way the car did. It was clean and functional and worn in the way of things that had been used honestly over time. He read Thomas's email again. Then he opened a new browser tab and looked up the Heartfelt Showcase registration page. The exhibitor registration was still open. The deadline was in 8 days. He looked at it for a while. His coffee went colder. Outside the window, the November dark pressed against the glass and the house settled around him with the ordinary sounds of old wood and inadequate insulation. He thought about his father, thought about the engine, thought about what it meant to be ready for something versus what it meant to need to be ready. He had known for 12 years. He had carried it carefully, the way his father had taught him to carry things. Not tightly, not desperately, but with the steady, deliberate attention of someone who understood that the right moment was a real thing, and that forcing it served nobody. He wasn't sure if this was the right moment. He was sure it was a moment. He went to the registration form and began filling it out, slowly and with his usual patience, the way he approached most things that mattered. The Heartfelt Convention Center sat on a flat stretch of land 40 minutes outside the city, a low-profile building that from the outside looked like something between a regional airport and a mid-tier hotel, and that on the inside transformed, during the annual collector showcase, into the kind of space where serious money moved quietly between serious people. The event ran over 2 days. Exhibitors set up on Friday. The main floor opened Saturday morning. Ethan arrived Friday at 7:15 with the Datsun on a flatbed trailer pulled behind a borrowed pickup truck. He could have driven it. The car ran fine, but trailer transport was standard practice for vehicles of significant historical value, and whatever else the Datsun was to him personally, he was not careless about it. He had been many things over the years, but careless was not one of them. The loading dock attendant directed him to Bay 14. Ethan backed the trailer in, unstrapped the car, and drove it off the ramp and onto the convention floor with the particular economy of someone who had done similar things many times. He pulled it into his assigned space, a modest floor allocation near the east wall, between a pristine 1967 Toyota 2000 GT that belonged to a collector from Vermont and a German-built BMW 2002 that had been restored to a condition that suggested more money than the original car had ever been worth. He cut the engine, sat for a moment in the quiet that followed, and then got out. The Datsun looked exactly like what it was. A car that had been driven, stored improperly for a period, maintained with commitment but not aestheticism, and preserved in the form in which it had come to its current owner. The copper-bronze paint was still mostly buried under the rust. The dented quarter panel was still dented. The electrical tape on the passenger mirror had not been replaced. Ethan had cleaned the engine bay with some care the previous week, not to conceal anything, but because the documentation deserved a clean surface, and he had vacuumed the interior and wiped down the dash. That was the extent of his preparation. He set up a small folding table beside the car and placed on it, in a clear archival display box, a selection of the documents his father had kept, the assembly notations, the materials certifications, the handwritten letter from the lead engineer written in Japanese with a careful English translation his father had typed on a separate sheet and clipped to it. He'd kept the original appraisal reports in their sealed envelopes. Those were in his jacket pocket. He wasn't going to put them on the table. If someone needed to see them, he'd decide in the moment whether they'd earned that. Thomas arrived at 8:30 and stood beside Ethan and looked at the display setup. "You're not putting a sign up?" Thomas asked. "What would it say?" Thomas looked at the table, at the car, at the rust and the tape and the dent, at the archival box with the documents visible inside. "No, I suppose it doesn't need one." They stood together for a moment. Around them, the convention floor was filling in slowly as other exhibitors moved vehicles into position and set up their displays. A few people had already started walking the floor, early arrivals doing reconnaissance. None of them stopped at Bay 14. They looked the way you look at something you've already categorized and moved on. "Alessandro lands this afternoon," Thomas said. "I spoke with him this morning." "You told him what you found?" "I told him I'd examined an engine I found significant and that I thought he should see it. That's all." Thomas paused. "I didn't use the program name. I didn't want to." "Set expectations," Ethan said. "Yes." Ethan nodded. He was looking at the Vermont Collector's 2000 GT, which was genuinely beautiful and in exceptional condition, the kind of car that deserved every effort that had gone into it. "How is he?" "Alessandro?" Thomas thought about it. "Older. His knees are bad. He uses a cane now, which he's furious about." A brief pause that contained something like affection. "Still sharp. Sharper than most people half his age." Did he seem curious? Alessandro Ricci is constitutionally incapable of not being curious. He asked me approximately 15 questions I wouldn't answer, and then accused me of being deliberately theatrical. Thomas smiled faintly. I told him I'd learned from the best. He said that was unacceptable flattery, and that he'd see me Saturday. The main floor opened at 9 Saturday morning. By 9:30, it had acquired the specific energy of a room where people are simultaneously performing casual interest and making calculations. The vehicles ranged from the historically significant to the simply expensive, and the people moving between them reflected the same range. Some were serious collectors with the particular attentiveness of people whose knowledge outpaced their budget. Some were serious buyers whose budget outpaced their knowledge. Some were press, carrying cameras with the practiced ease of people who'd learned to look like they belonged at events they hadn't been sure they'd be invited to. Vanessa Sterling arrived with 2 colleagues from Pinnacle at 10 o'clock, and Rachel came with them, because she had asked to, and Vanessa had said yes after a pause that lasted exactly long enough for Rachel to understand it had been a considered answer. Rachel had not told Vanessa that Ethan was exhibiting. She'd found out herself 2 days earlier through the published exhibitor list, where his name appeared without any description of the vehicle. She'd told her father, who'd already known. She had not told Vanessa, and she was not entirely sure whether she was making the right choice about that. But it felt like information that should arrive on its own terms, at its own speed, which was how most important things arrived if you let them. The corporate table Pinnacle had sponsored was on the mezzanine level, above the main floor, with a view down over the vehicle displays. Vanessa went up briefly to check it and speak with the event director, who treated her with the professional warmth he applied to all sponsors, and then she came back down to the main floor and started moving through the exhibits with the focused attention she brought to any environment she entered. Rachel stayed close but slightly behind, in the way of someone whose job description overlapped with social camouflage. She watched the exhibits and she watched Vanessa, and she tracked in her peripheral vision the geography of the room. Where Thomas was standing near the east wall, where the clusters of press were concentrated, where a man in his late 60s with silver hair and a wooden cane was making his way slowly through the outer ring of displays with the deliberateness of someone who is looking for something specific. Alessandro Ricci walked the way people walked when their knees had given them years of trouble. Carefully, with the weight shifted slightly, each step considered. But his eyes moved the way young eyes moved, fast and searching and entirely unsentimental. He had the tanned, creased face of someone who had spent decades in good climates and bad lighting, and he wore a jacket that was well made and showing its age in a way that suggested he preferred it that way. Rachel watched him cross the main floor, watched him stop at a display of early Porsche 356 variants, and examine them with professional appreciation and then move on. Watched him pause at the Vermont Collector's Toyota 2000 GT and spend 4 minutes there, which was meaningful. And then she watched him continue east along the row, and slow, and stop. Bay 14. The rust-covered Datsun and the small folding table with the archival box. Ethan standing to the side with his arms crossed, and the expression he apparently wore everywhere, which was no particular expression at all. She watched Alessandro look at the car. She couldn't hear anything from where she was standing. She was 30 feet away and the ambient noise of the room was between them. But she could see the change in Alessandro's posture, something that straightened almost imperceptibly, a realignment that came from the inside. He took 2 steps closer. He looked at the hood. He looked at Ethan. He said something. Ethan nodded. Alessandro pointed at the hood. Ethan reached in and pulled the release. The hood came up the way it always did, with the slight resistance of a latch that had been opening and closing for 50-plus years, and had developed opinions about the process. Ethan propped it with the original support rod and stepped back. Alessandro moved to the engine bay and stood over it, and the cane was in his right hand, but he wasn't using it for weight. His eyes moved through the engine in the way a fluent reader moves through text, not scanning, reading, taking in specific things in a specific order. Thomas appeared at his shoulder from somewhere. Rachel didn't see where he'd come from. He must have been watching. Alessandro said something in Italian. Not to either of them, just out loud, the way people speak when a thought escapes containment. Then he said in English, "The intake manifold." "Yes," Thomas said. Alessandro pointed with 2 fingers at the casting mark near the manifold's base. "What does this say?" "It's a program notation," Ethan said. He didn't need to look at where Alessandro was pointing. He knew the engine by feel at this point. Not a production code. The first 2 characters are a date notation, and the third is an engineer initial. Alessandro was very still. "Whose initial?" "Takeshi Mori." Silence. Thomas and Alessandro exchanged a look over the engine bay, the kind of look that passed between people who shared a long context and didn't need to speak it. "Mori passed in 2009, Alessandro said, to nobody in particular. "I know," Ethan said. "I attended his memorial lecture series in Osaka. I introduced myself to his son." Alessandro looked up from the engine and looked at Ethan directly for the first time since he'd stopped at the car. He had the eyes of a man who had been doing this long enough that he no longer extended trust automatically, but that also recognized it quickly when he encountered it. He studied Ethan for a moment. "You have documentation," he said. "I do." "May I?" Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and produced one of the sealed envelopes. He held it without opening it. "I had this assessed in 2015 by 2 independent experts. Both signed confidentiality agreements before examination. Both assessments concur. He paused. I'm not showing you this to prove something. I'm showing you because you've spent longer looking for this program than almost anyone, and I think that matters. Alessandro Ricci looked at the sealed envelope. Then he looked at the car again. Who built this engine? He said. Not a question exactly, more like a man saying a sentence he'd been assembling for a long time. My father's name was James Mercer, Ethan said. He was a machinist and engine builder. He spent 3 years working with the P-76 team as an external technical consultant. He spoke enough Japanese to work. He was extraordinarily good at his job and he was trusted enough to be there, which should tell you something about how the program operated. He stopped. When the program ended, the lead engineer gave him the engine. He didn't ask for it. It was given. The letter on the table explains why. Alessandro moved to the table. He looked at the archival box without touching it. His eyes traveled over the assembly notations and the certifications and the letter. He bent slightly to read the English translation. He stood up and did not say anything for a full 20 seconds. Then, "How long have you known?" "My whole life," Ethan said. Understanding it took longer. Some. What happened next happened in the way that things go from contained to public. Not all at once, but in the incremental, irreversible way of water finding a crack. Alessandro asked 2 more questions, then turned to Thomas and spoke quietly in a register Rachel couldn't hear. Thomas nodded. Alessandro took out his phone and made a call, speaking in Italian for 3 minutes while standing beside the Datsun. When he hung up, he spoke to Ethan again, and whatever he said made Ethan look at the floor for a moment and then back up with an expression that Rachel couldn't fully read from where she was standing. Something between acknowledgement and the specific discomfort of a private person receiving the thing they have always known was coming. The press photographer noticed Alessandro Ricci before he noticed the car. That was inevitable. Ricci was a known figure in collector circles, and his name was in the event program as an attending dignitary. A journalist for an automotive trade publication who was covering the showcase saw Ricci stop at Bay 14 and spend 20 minutes there, which was 20 minutes more than Ricci had spent anywhere else on the floor. And the journalist walked over and stood close enough to observe without interrupting, and then walked away and made a phone call. By 11:15, 3 people with cameras had clustered at a respectful distance from Bay 14. By 11:45, it was 6. Rachel saw all of this from the edge of the action. She had moved closer over the past hour, gradually, in the way you move toward something without having made a decision to move toward it. She was 15 feet from the car when Vanessa found her. Vanessa appeared at her elbow with the particular expression of someone who has been watching something develop from a distance and has decided it's time to be in the room. "What's happening over there?" Rachel looked at her. "You should probably go see for yourself." "Rachel." "The car we're looking at belongs to Ethan Mercer," Rachel said, "the man from the sidewalk. That man with the cane is Alessandro Ricci. He's an internationally recognized authority on post-war Japanese performance vehicles, and he's been looking for evidence of a specific engineering program for approximately 30 years. She paused. "He appears to have found it." Vanessa went still. "The engine in that rust-covered car," Rachel continued, not unkindly but not gently either, "is believed to be one of possibly 3 examples ever built of an experimental powertrain from the early 1970s that was thought to no longer exist in any form. My father has examined it. Alessandro Ricci has examined it. 2 previous independent experts have examined it and put their assessments in writing." "How much?" Vanessa said, which was how Vanessa processed things, by going immediately to quantifiable stakes. "I don't know. I don't think that's the point right now." Vanessa looked at the car, at the growing cluster of cameras and people, at Alessandro Ricci, who was standing beside it now, with the comfortable authority of someone who had earned his position there, speaking to a journalist in careful, measured sentences. At Ethan Mercer, who was standing to the side of all of it in his worn field coat and brown boots, and who was answering questions when asked and not performing any version of anything for anyone. Rachel watched Vanessa look at all of this. She watched the thing Diane had named over drinks, the assessment instinct, the fast categorical read based on visible surfaces, run up against something it couldn't resolve the same way. "The tape on the mirror," Vanessa said quietly. "What about it?" "I made a joke about it on the sidewalk." She was not speaking loudly. She was speaking the way people spoke when they were saying something to themselves rather than to the person beside them. He didn't say anything. No, Rachel said. He didn't. Vanessa was quiet for another moment. Then she straightened in the way she did when she'd made a decision, and Rachel recognized that straightening and couldn't tell yet whether it was the right call or the wrong one. I'm going to go talk to him, Vanessa said. Now? Rachel looked at the cameras, at the people, at the 11:45 atmosphere of a situation that was moving toward something public. No, not now. She held Rachel's gaze for a moment. Later. Alessandro Ricci spoke to a journalist for 14 minutes. He was careful and exact, and he said the words he was willing to say on record, and not one word more, which was the particular discipline of someone who had seen what happened when expertise became careless in public. He confirmed that he had examined the vehicle. He confirmed that the engine appeared consistent with documentation from the P-76 engineering program of the early 1970s. He said he would not characterize the significance of the find until further formal examination could be conducted. And then he said, because he was Alessandro Ricci and had spent 30 years thinking about this, that if further examination confirmed what he currently believed, the historical significance of the discovery would be considerable. Considerable was the word he used. In Alessandro Ricci's vocabulary, that word carried the weight that most people would render as extraordinary. The journalist filed a dispatch at 12:40. By 2 in the afternoon, the Heartfield event floor had a different energy than it had started with. The dispatch had been picked up by 2 automotive news aggregators and shared through the collector community's informal networks. The group chats, the forums, the private contact lists of people who paid attention to this corner of the world. More press showed up. 2 collectors who had spent time near other exhibits gradually migrated toward Bay 14 and stayed. Ethan fielded questions steadily, without apparent stress, in the same tone he used for everything, calm, specific, neither modest nor excessive. He answered what he knew and didn't fill the space where he didn't know. He showed the documentation in the archival box to people he felt were asking in good faith, which was most of them. He declined to speculate about valuation and said so plainly when asked. He said the car was not for sale when someone asked that, and the way he said it did not invite follow-up. By 3 o'clock, the event organizer, a nervous man named Hal Draper, who ran the showcase with the perpetual anxiety of someone who suspected the thing he'd built was more fragile than it appeared, had positioned himself strategically near Bay 14 and was receiving the attention that poured into any vacuum near a significant event. He gave several background interviews. He said he had of course known the Mercer vehicle would be significant when the registration came in, which was not precisely true, and which Thomas Bennett, standing nearby, absorbed with the expression of someone choosing not to correct a small, unnecessary lie. A collector from Dallas named Preston Whitmore introduced himself to Ethan at 3:15 and said he was prepared to begin a serious conversation about acquisition. He was wearing a belt buckle that cost more than most cars on the floor and had the confidence of a man who had never been told no by something money could reach. "Not for sale," Ethan said. "I haven't made an offer yet." "You won't need to. The answer's the same." Preston Whitmore looked at him with the particular expression of someone who had not heard that sentence recently enough to have a ready response to it. "You understand what this car is worth?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Do you?" Whitmore held his gaze for a moment. Then he said he'd leave his card in case Ethan changed his mind and walked away with the dignity of a man preserving options he no longer had. Vanessa had spent the afternoon doing something she almost never did voluntarily, which was observing without participating. She sat at the Pinnacle corporate table on the mezzanine for a while. She walked the outer edge of the main floor. She watched Ethan from a distance at different points throughout the afternoon. At the engine bay with Alessandro, at the table with the documents, at the far edge of the bay, when Whitmore approached and was turned away. She was trying to understand something, and she couldn't get to it directly, so she was circling it. She'd built a career on pattern recognition, on identifying what something was from its visible characteristics and acting on that identification before other people finished processing. It had served her extraordinarily well. It had also, on the sidewalk 2 months ago, produced a performance she could not stop replaying, which was a new and unpleasant experience. The problem was not just that she'd been wrong about the car. She'd been wrong about things before and handled it. The problem was what the wrongness revealed about the mechanism. She'd seen rust and tape and worn clothing and a man who didn't seem to care what she thought of him, and she'd decided she understood the situation in about 4 seconds. She hadn't been doing anything unusual. She'd been doing what she always did, and what she always did had put her in a position in front of witnesses and cameras and 2 of her own employees of publicly humiliating one of the most knowledgeable people in his field while he sat in a vehicle that her own understanding of value couldn't begin to assess. The fact that he hadn't responded, that he'd sat there and read his book while she performed her certainty for an audience, that was the detail she kept returning to. He'd had every tool necessary to dismantle her completely, right there on that sidewalk, and he hadn't picked up a single one, not out of inability, out of a choice that said, I have more important things to do with what I know. She was not accustomed to looking at people and feeling like the smaller one in the exchange. Rachel found her father at 4:30 near the east wall, away from the main concentration of people around Bay 14. He was talking to a woman Rachel didn't recognize, and he made a brief introduction before the woman excused herself, and then Thomas and Rachel stood together and looked at the floor. How is he? Rachel asked, meaning Ethan. Steady, Thomas said. He's always steady. Is he okay with all of this? The cameras, I think he's okay with it. I don't think he loves it. Thomas watched the bay from across the room. He's been carrying this for a long time. I think there's some relief in it, even if the relief isn't comfortable. That makes sense. He told me this morning, Thomas said, that his father never wanted recognition for the car. He wanted recognition for the work, for the 3 years of it, for the specific exceptional thing he'd done as a craftsman and a collaborator on something that mattered. He paused. The car surviving is proof the work happened. That's what it is to him. Rachel thought about that, about James Mercer in a workshop in the early 70s, building something remarkable inside a program that nobody outside of a small circle knew existed, and then coming home with the proof of it, keeping it in a storage unit, telling his son about it slowly over years, not because he needed validation, but because he needed someone to carry it forward properly. She wants to talk to him, Rachel said. Vanessa. Thomas looked at her. When? Later. She said not now. I think she's actually trying to do the right thing. I'm not entirely sure she knows what that is yet. Does she need to know exactly what it is to start moving toward it? Rachel thought about that. No, she said. Probably not. A small eruption of noise from across the room pulled their attention. Not dramatic, just a sudden increase in conversation level and the particular sound of cameras firing. Rachel and Thomas turned to look. The event's freelance photographer had taken a position at a slight angle that captured the full length of the Datsun from the rear quarter panel forward, and in that frame the rust and the tape and the dent were fully visible. And so was the hood open and the engine within, and the people clustered around it. Alessandro Ricci with his cane, 2 other figures she recognized as documented experts who had arrived in the last hour, 3 journalists with notebooks. And at the edge of the frame, slightly apart from all of it, Ethan Mercer standing with his arms crossed and his eyes on the engine, and his expression that of a man looking at something he had known for a very long time and was watching the rest of the world find its way too. The photographer shot it several times. One of those shots would later appear in 3 publications, 1 automotive and 2 general interest. It would be described in captions variously as the moment of discovery, the reveal at Heartfelt, and, in the caption that Ethan himself, when he eventually saw it, found closest to accurate, a car that was always this valuable, surrounded by people who had just found that out. By 5 o'clock, the event organizer had quietly extended the floor time by an hour. Nobody had asked him to. He'd just done it, in the pragmatic way of someone managing an event that had exceeded its own expectations and didn't want to be the person who called time on it prematurely. Ethan stood in Bay 14 and answered questions and showed documentation and declined purchase offers and watched people look at his father's engine. He did not perform a motion. He did not give anyone a speech. When a journalist asked him how it felt to have the car recognized, he thought about it honestly before answering. My father did good work, he said. It's good that people know. The journalist waited for more. That's the whole answer, Ethan said, and turned back to the car. Vanessa left the event at 6:30. She drove back to the city alone, which she almost never did. She usually had a driver, because she'd told the driver she'd find her own way, and she hadn't entirely meant to say that, but she'd said it and couldn't take it back. She drove the 40 minutes in the November dark, thinking about a rust-covered car and a man who hadn't bothered to tell her who he was, and about the specific architecture of her own certainty, and about what it cost when that certainty was applied to things it couldn't actually measure. She was not a person who spent a lot of time in that kind of thinking. She found it unproductive in most circumstances. But she'd been finding it unavoidable for 2 months now, and the afternoon at Hartfield had stripped away whatever remaining ambiguity she'd been using to defer it. She'd been wrong, not just about the car, about the entire transaction, and she had done it publicly, and the public hadn't forgotten, and she wasn't sure she had the right to want them to. She got home at 7:15 and poured a glass of water and stood at her kitchen window for a while, looking at the city lights. Then she went to her desk and opened her laptop and typed Ethan Mercer's name into a search engine. The results were beginning to change already. The first 3 entries were from the last 6 hours. She clicked the first one, the dispatch from the automotive trade journalist who'd been on the floor at Hartfield, and read it. She read it carefully, the way she read things when she was not going to allow herself to skim. Then she read it again. She closed the laptop and went to bed and lay there in the dark thinking about a man who had sat on a public sidewalk and read a paperback novel while the world walked past him and did not know what it was looking at. She thought about what it took to carry something that carefully, for that long, with that little need for anyone else to see it. She had spent 20 years building a version of herself that the world could see from a distance and immediately understand. She had made it large and clear and unambiguous on purpose because that was how you controlled the read. That was how you made sure nobody else got to decide what you were worth. Ethan Mercer had done the opposite. He'd carried his worth in places nobody could see and waited, with apparent patience, for the moment that understanding would arrive on its own terms. She was not sure which approach was right. She was increasingly sure that she had applied hers in directions it wasn't designed for and hadn't noticed until it cost her something. The city was quiet outside her window. The case hadn't resolved itself into anything she could act on yet. But the thinking was happening now, which was further along than it had been at 9 in the morning, and Vanessa Sterling was not someone who started moving toward something and stopped. The story broke properly on Monday morning, not the trade dispatch from Saturday that had circulated through collector networks and automotive press over the weekend, picking up shares and commentary in the specific self-contained way that niche stories traveled before the general world noticed them. What happened Monday was different. A features editor at a national newspaper had seen the dispatch, had called Alessandro Ricci on Sunday evening, and had filed a piece that ran in the paper's arts and culture section under a headline that described the discovery as one of the most significant finds in post-war automotive history. The piece was not long, but it was well written and it got the details right, which was rarer than it should have been, and it was the kind of story that traveled because it had the structural satisfaction of a thing that rewards patience, a quiet man, a battered car, a 50-year-old secret that had been sitting in plain sight. By noon Monday, it had been picked up by 4 wire services. By 3 in the afternoon, it was on 2 major television network websites. By evening, it had crossed into general circulation in the way that things crossed into general circulation now, fast, slightly distorted at the edges, the specific details accurate, but the emotional temperature amplified at each relay until the story that most people were reading was a slightly more dramatic version of what had actually happened. The version most people were reading included the sidewalk incident. Ethan had not mentioned it to any journalist. He hadn't needed to. Someone who had been there, one of the women who'd been exiting the Pinnacle lobby, Rachel later concluded, though she was never certain, had told the story on a collector forum the same weekend as Hartfield, and by the time the national piece ran, the forum thread had been discovered and quoted. The piece itself mentioned the incident only briefly, in a single sentence that described Ethan's car as having been publicly mocked by a bystander weeks before the Hartfield showcase, but that single sentence was, for most readers, the part that lodged. It had the quality of a detail that does the emotional work of the whole story. The rust-covered car, the dismissive crowd, the quiet man who said nothing. And then, 2 months later, the engine under the hood confirmed as a piece of engineering history that people in the field had been looking for since the 1990s. The firm's name was not in the piece. Vanessa Sterling's name was not in the piece, but the forum thread was public, and the forum thread had names, And by Tuesday morning, 2 entertainment and gossip-adjacent publications had connected the dots and run short items that named Pinnacle Capital Partners and its CEO explicitly. Vanessa found out about those items from Elena, her personal assistant, at 7:58 in the morning, 2 minutes before her first scheduled call. Elena delivered the information with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that the next several hours required a very steady hand and that her job was to hold the ground steady without editorializing. "How bad?" Vanessa said. "The 2 items are small publications. The forum thread is more visible." A pause. "There are several hundred comments." "On the thread?" "Yes. And on the items." Vanessa sat with this for a moment. She was at her desk, coffee in hand, already dressed in the way she was always already dressed before 8, and the morning light was coming through the east-facing window of her office at an angle that caught the edge of her desk and made a hard line of brightness across the surface. She looked at that line. "Have we received any press inquiries?" "One, last evening. I've held it." "Don't respond yet." She set her coffee down. "Get me Rachel." Tum. Rachel had seen the items before she left her apartment. She'd known they were coming. She'd been watching the forum thread over the weekend with the fatalistic attention of someone watching a wave form offshore. And she'd spent Sunday evening deciding how to handle the fact that she worked for the person at the center of this particular story, and that her own position was complicated by everything she knew and had not said. She sat across from Vanessa at the small conference table beside Vanessa's desk, not in the client chair, which would have felt off, but in the working arrangement they used when it was just the 2 of them with something to go through. Vanessa set her phone face down on the table. "I need to understand your position." "My position on what?" "On everything. On what you knew, when you knew it, and what you think I should do." Rachel looked at her. "I can tell you what I knew and when. The rest is your call." "Tell me," she told her. Completely this time, without the partial disclosure she'd offered before. The email exchange with Ethan, the second visit, her father's assessment, the technical history she'd researched, the Hartfield registration she'd found and not mentioned. She laid it out in the same sequence it had happened, and Vanessa listened without interrupting, which Rachel noted because Vanessa interrupting was the default. When she finished, Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "You didn't tell me he was exhibiting at Hartfield." "No." "Why?" Rachel chose the honest answer over the diplomatic one. "Because I wasn't sure what you'd do with it." Vanessa received this without flinching, which suggested she'd already arrived at the same thought on her own. "And now?" "Now I don't know. You said Saturday that you wanted to talk to him." "I do." "Then that's probably where you should start." Rachel paused. Not a press strategy, not a statement. Him first. Vanessa looked at the phone on the table. "Can you get me his contact information?" "I have his email. I don't have a phone number." "Email is fine. Draft something for me to review." Rachel shook her head. "No, you should write it yourself." Vanessa looked up. "I've drafted your communications for 9 years," Rachel said. "This one should come from you in the way it actually comes from you. He'll know the difference." The silence between them was not comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It had the texture of 2 people who had been in a professional arrangement long enough that they could say real things to each other without the relationship breaking, which was rarer than most workplaces acknowledged. "All right," Vanessa said, not happily, but without argument. The press inquiry sat in the holding queue until Wednesday, by which point there were 4 more. Vanessa's communications director, a man named Scott, who had the particular skill set of someone who managed exits and entries for public figures, recommended a brief factual statement that acknowledged the incident without expanding on it and expressed congratulations to Ethan on the significance of the discovery. Vanessa reviewed the draft twice and then set it aside and told Scott she'd get back to him. She was still writing the email to Ethan. She'd started it Sunday night and had rewritten it 4 times over 3 days, which was not how she operated. She operated fast, on instinct, with the confidence of someone who had made a practice of trusting the first version of herself that showed up. The fact that she couldn't get this particular email to sit right was information she was trying to accept without fighting it. The drafts had gone through several registers. The first was formal to the point of feeling like a legal document. The second overcorrected into warmth that she reread the next morning and found unconvincing. The The third was precise and brief, and probably too controlled. The fourth she'd gotten halfway through and stopped because she realized she was still managing the optics of it, still writing the version that worked best for Vanessa Sterling's image. And that was the wrong thing to be writing. She sat at her kitchen table on Wednesday evening and opened a new document and wrote without stopping. Mr. Mercer, my name is Vanessa Sterling. You may not remember me. I'm the woman from the sidewalk outside Pinnacle's building 2 months ago. I said some things about you and your car that were rude and thoughtless, and I said them in front of other people, which made them worse than they already were. I've spent a lot of time since then learning who you are and what the car actually is. And I want to be clear that neither of those things is what changed how I feel about what I did. What I did was wrong before I knew any of that. I was dismissive of a person I hadn't bothered to understand, and I did it publicly and without any apparent awareness that it might be worth thinking about. I don't have a good explanation for that, other than that it's a habit I've built over a long time, and Heartfield was the first time I've had to look at it plainly. I'm asking if you'd be willing to meet, not because I want anything from you. I'm not interested in a business relationship or a photo opportunity, or whatever else you might reasonably assume this is. I'd like to apologize properly, which I understand is something I should have done before I needed several hundred strangers on a forum to make the case for it. If you'd rather not, I understand that completely. Vanessa Sterling. She read it once, then she copied it into an email and sent it before she could revise it. Chetty. Ethan read the email at his kitchen table the following morning, over coffee, before he'd checked anything else. He read it twice. He sat with it for a while, looking out the window at the November yard, which was mostly brown and bare in the way of November yards, and thought about what he wanted to do. He had received, in the past week, 47 emails, 7 from journalists, 12 from collectors or their representatives expressing interest in the vehicle, 4 from automotive historians or academics requesting examination access, 6 from people he didn't know who had some variation of a personal story about the car or the program that they wanted to share. The rest were professional inquiries of various kinds, and 3 were from Preston Whitmore's office, trying 3 different angles on a conversation that had already been closed on the Heartfield floor. He had responded to the historians and academics with measured, considered replies. He had declined the collector inquiries directly and without elaboration. He had not responded to the press. He had not responded to Preston Whitmore. He read Vanessa Sterling's email a 3rd time. What struck him was not the apology itself, though the apology was genuine. He could tell the difference between something written to manage a situation and something written because the person needed to say it, and this was the second thing. What struck him was the sentence in the middle. What I did was wrong before I knew any of that, because that was the part she didn't have to say. She could have written an email that was functionally an apology while leaning on the subsequent discovery to carry the emotional weight of it. A lot of people would have done that. She hadn't. He didn't respond that day. He thought it was fair to make her wait a little, not out of cruelty, but because the waiting was honest. He wasn't someone who made fast decisions about things that mattered, and this mattered in a way he was still sorting out. He went about his day, which involved a phone call with Alessandro's assistant, about a formal examination being organized for early December, a drive out to the storage unit to check on the car, and an hour in the afternoon sitting with the engineering documents his father had kept, reading through the material certifications the way he sometimes did when he needed to feel grounded in the real thing rather than the public version of it. The documents were in his father's handwriting and the handwriting of engineers who were now dead, and they described in precise technical language a piece of work that had been done with exceptional care in a small window of time by people who hadn't known anyone would care about it later. That was the nature of good work, his father had said once. You don't do it knowing the future. You do it knowing the standard. He wrote back the following morning. 4 sentences. Ms. Sterling, I remember you. I appreciate you writing this. I'm available most Saturday mornings. If you want to see the car, I think that's the right place for the conversation. He included the address of the storage unit and sent it. Bam. The formal announcement from the Automotive History Foundation that Alessandro Ricci was affiliated with came on Friday. It was a press release rather than a news piece, and it was written in the measured language of institutions that are accustomed to making significant declarations without hyperbole. But even in that measured language, the conclusion was not ambiguous. Following initial examination by Ricci and Thomas Bennett and 2 additional experts with relevant credentials, The engine in the Mercer vehicle was assessed with high confidence as a surviving example of the P-76 engineering program, representing, as far as current documentation could confirm, the only known surviving unit in operational condition. The release did not include a valuation. Ethan had specifically requested that. Valuations invited a particular kind of attention that he had no interest in. The release also, at Ethan's request, included a section that most people skimmed but that he had cared most about. It described James Mercer, his background, his work, his role in the P-76 program as an external technical consultant, his craft and his precision, and the trust that the program engineers had placed in him. It gave James Mercer's name to the public record in a way it had never appeared before, and it described his contribution with the specificity that expertise deserved, not a footnote, not a passing mention, but a substantive accounting of what he had actually done. Ethan read that section twice when the draft was sent to him for review. He approved it without changes. Thomas called him that evening. "It reads well." "It does. How are you holding up?" "Fine." A pause. "Tired, maybe? Not of the thing itself, of the noise around it." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That fades. It always does." "I know." Ethan looked out the window at the dark yard. "Alessandro asked me again about the December examination." "I know. He called me too. Will you do it?" "Yes. If it goes where he thinks it might, the program record becomes more complete. That matters." He paused. "For my father's name, it matters." Thomas said, "Your father was a remarkable craftsman." "He was an ordinary man who took his work seriously," Ethan said, "which I think was what made him remarkable. He wasn't trying to be, he just was." Thomas didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Rachel asked about you. She didn't ask me to tell you that, so you can decide what to do with it." Ethan let that sit without responding directly. "Tell her I appreciate everything she did. The email she sent, the first one. That was a decent thing to do." "I'll tell her." Vanessa confirmed Saturday morning by email. 3 words. "I'll be there." She drove herself, which she'd been doing more often since the drive back from Hartfield. She had a driver available and she was increasingly choosing not to use him for certain things, which she didn't examine too closely because she was still in the process of understanding what it meant. She drove the 2 hours out of the city with the radio off, which she also almost never did, and the quiet of the car was uncomfortable for the first half hour and then simply became the conditions of the drive. The storage facility was unremarkable: a gravel lot, a row of corrugated metal units, an attendant booth with a space heater visible through the window. Ethan's truck was already there, and the unit's rolling door was up, and the Datsun sat inside in the gray morning light. He was standing beside it, hands in his jacket pockets, when she pulled in. He watched her get out of her car without expression. She had dressed without thinking too hard about it, which was unusual. She usually dressed with the precise consciousness of someone who understood that clothes were a language. That morning, she'd put on what she wore on days off: dark jeans, ankle boots, a coat that was good quality but not conspicuous. She hadn't done it strategically. She'd done it and then noticed what she'd done and decided it was probably right. "Miss Sterling," he said. "Ethan." She'd used his first name because it seemed right, and then immediately wondered if it was. "Thank you for agreeing to this." "You drove 2 hours," he said. That seemed like it deserved a yes. She looked at the car. Up close, in the daylight, it was different from how she remembered it from the sidewalk. Not different in its condition. The rust was still there, the dent, the tape. But different in the way your perception of something shifts when you know what it is. She'd stood next to it on that sidewalk and seen a punchline. She was standing next to it now and seeing something she didn't have a word for that was approximately the opposite of that. "Can I look at it?" she asked. "That's why we're here." She walked around it slowly. She looked at the quarter panel dent and remembered making a joke about demolition derbies and felt the specific embarrassment of someone who has been very stupid in a very permanent way. She looked at the tape on the mirror. She looked at the rear of the car where the bumper mount had failed. "The things I said," she started. "You said them in your email." "I know. I wanted to say them in person, too." Ethan looked at her. He was not making it easy, but he wasn't making it hard either. He was just present, in the way she'd noticed on the sidewalk and hadn't known how to read. Fully there, without performance, without effort. "I'm listening," he said. She took a breath. I judged you without any basis for it other than what I could see, and I did it out loud in front of other people. And I thought I was being, I don't know, I thought I was being perceptive, quick. That was how I read it at the time, if I was being generous to myself. She stopped. But the truth is I wasn't thinking about it at all. I just did it. And that's actually the worst version. He was quiet. I don't know how to fully apologize for something that was so automatic, she said. I can tell you I've thought about it a lot. I can tell you it showed me something about myself I didn't know was there, or I guess I knew and hadn't looked at it directly. But none of that fixes what it was like to have a stranger say those things about you in front of a crowd. Ethan looked at the car for a moment. Then he said, "Can I show you something?" She waited. He reached in through the driver's window and pulled the hood release, lifted the hood, propped it, stepped back. She moved to stand beside him, looking down at the engine. She didn't have his knowledge. She didn't have Thomas Bennett's knowledge. She couldn't read what she was looking at the way they read it. But she looked at it for a long time anyway, trying to see it as honestly as she could. "Your father built this," she said. "He worked on it, part of a team. But his hands were on it, yes. And he kept it because it was his, and because it was proof." He looked at the engine with the specific quality of attention you gave to something you'd looked at 10,000 times and still found something in. His work was real. It happened. This is the evidence of it. She understood that. She understood it in a way she hadn't expected to, standing in a gravel lot outside a storage facility with the November cold coming through her coat. She'd spent her career making her work visible, making her success a thing people could see and confirm and measure. She understood the need for evidence. She just hadn't understood that evidence could take this form, that it could be this quiet, this patient, this indifferent to whether anyone else recognized it. "I thought visible success was the reliable measure," she said. It wasn't quite directed at him. It was more like thinking out loud, which she rarely did in front of people. "Of what?" he asked. "Of worth, of competence, achievement, all of it. I built an entire way of working around that assumption." Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "It's not a wrong assumption everywhere. But it's not right everywhere either." "No," he said, "it isn't." She looked at the engine a while longer. "Alessandro Ricci called the discovery considerable," she said. "I read that he uses that word the way other people use extraordinary." "He does." "What do you think it's worth? You don't have to answer that in dollars. I mean, what do you think it represents?" He thought about the question as though it deserved thinking about. "Proof that the work happened. Proof that my father was there and that he was trusted to be there and that what he built was good enough to survive 50 years. He paused. "The dollar figure people put on it is about rarity. What it's actually worth is about evidence. Those are two different calculations." Vanessa stood there and let that land properly. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. "On the sidewalk, you could have. Any of it would have been enough. One sentence." He looked at her. "About what?" "About who you are. What the car was. Anything." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Would it have mattered? In that moment, with the audience you had, would knowing who I was have changed what you'd done?" She opened her mouth, closed it. "It would have made you feel bad in front of people," he said. Not cruelly, just plainly. "Which is different from you actually understanding something, and I wasn't interested in making you feel bad in front of people." She absorbed that. "Then what were you interested in?" "Gonna read my book," he said. "My niece was at a science fair. I had 2 hours." Something happened in her throat. Not quite a laugh, not quite the thing that preceded tears. Something that was both and neither, coming from a place she didn't usually access in front of people she'd met twice. She pressed her lips together and looked at the engine, and then at the dented quarter panel, and then at the tape on the mirror. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm not the same person I was on that sidewalk. I know that sounds like something people say. I'm saying it anyway." Ethan looked at her for a moment. He had the quality of someone who was deciding something. "I know," he said. "You wouldn't be here if you were." The offers came throughout November in a variety of forms and from a variety of angles, and Ethan declined everyone with the same consistency he'd maintained since Hartfield. Preston Whitmore's office made 4 more contact attempts, and finally sent a formal letter of offer by certified mail. The figure on the letter was specific and significant, and Ethan read it once, set it on his kitchen table, and looked at it for exactly as long as it took him to confirm that the number changed nothing about his position. He wrote back a single line, "Thank you for the offer. The vehicle is not for sale." He mailed it. A representative from a Japanese Automotive Heritage Foundation reached out through Alessandro's network. They were interested in a long-term loan arrangement. The car would remain Ethan's property, but would be exhibited and studied as part of a traveling historical collection. He told them he'd think about it. He was still thinking about it. He didn't rush that kind of decision. 2 museums, 3 private collectors, an insurance firm specializing in rare vehicles inquiring about representation, a documentary production company that wanted to make a film about the car, the discovery, and they were transparent about this, the sidewalk incident, which they described in their email as a remarkable reversal of fortune narrative. He didn't respond to the documentary company. He did, unexpectedly, respond to a letter that arrived the second week of November from a woman named Carol Mori, who was the daughter of Takeshi Mori, the lead engineer whose initial was on the casting mark. She had read about the discovery in a Japanese automotive magazine and written to him in careful, formal English to say that her father had mentioned the P-76 program once, near the end of his life, as the work he was most proud of, and that he had spoken about an American craftsman whose precision he had trusted completely, and that she was glad to know the engine had survived and had been cared for properly. Ethan read that letter twice, and then sat at his kitchen table for a while without doing anything else. Then he wrote back, taking a full hour with the letter, describing his father's account of the program, the way James had spoken about Maury's engineering precision, the atmosphere of the workshop as his father had described it, collaborative and exacting, and alive in the way of people doing something they understood to matter. He told her that the engine had been cared for because his father had made it clear, without ever making a speech about it, that care was the appropriate response to work done well. He sealed the letter and mailed it, and felt, for the first time since Heartfield, that the most important correspondence of the whole event had just gone out. Rachel had watched the aftermath from her particular vantage point, inside Pinnacle, close enough to Vanessa to observe the change, far enough to maintain the perspective she'd built over the past 2 months of looking at things more carefully. The press attention had crested and receded in roughly 10 days, as press attention did. The forum thread was still active, but quieter. The small items naming Pinnacle had been absorbed into the background noise of a story that was primarily about the car and the man and the history, not about a CEO who'd made a careless comment on a sidewalk. The comment had a life in the story, but it wasn't the story. Vanessa had not issued the statement Scott had drafted. She told him, in language that Scott had needed a moment to process, that she didn't think a formal statement was the right response, and that the right response had already happened in a gravel lot 2 hours from the city, and that the firm's public position was going to be no position. Scott had argued briefly, and then accepted it with the professional grace of someone who picked his battles. Rachel had heard about the Saturday meeting from Vanessa directly, which was unusual. Vanessa didn't usually debrief. She came back from things and moved forward from things. The fact that she'd sat down with Rachel on Monday morning and talked about the visit, not in a managed way, but in the way of someone who was still sorting through the experience, that was different. "He asked me something," Vanessa had said, "whether knowing who he was on the sidewalk would have changed anything, and the answer was no. Knowing who he was would have just made me feel bad in a more visible way. The understanding had to come from somewhere else." Rachel had listened without commenting. "I don't know if understanding changes behavior permanently," Vanessa said. "I think probably it depends on whether you actually let it get to the level where it changes something structural rather than just surface. I've been thinking about that." "That's the harder version," Rachel said. "Yeah." Vanessa looked out the window. "I know." It wasn't resolution. Rachel was clear-eyed enough about Vanessa Sterling not to read a 2-month reckoning as a transformation. Vanessa was still Vanessa, fast, certain, capable of the same quick categorical reads she'd always made. But there was something in the way she was carrying those reads now, a fractional pause before she committed to them, that hadn't been there before. Whether it lasted was a different question. Whether it was the beginning of something was a different question. Rachel didn't know the answer to either, and she thought that was probably the honest place to be. She thought about Ethan at his kitchen table, reading a letter from Takeshi Mori's daughter. She thought about the letter he'd sent back. She thought about a man who had spent his whole adult life building the knowledge to be worthy of the thing he was carrying, and who had done that quietly, without an audience, in the specific faith that the right moment would arrive in its own time. She was not sure she'd met someone like that before. She was not sure she'd known how to recognize it if she had. Outside her office window, the November city was going into its late afternoon gray, the light flat and indifferent the way it got this time of year, and the street below was full of people moving through it without thinking about what it looked like. She watched them for a moment and then went back to work. The December examination took place on a Thursday in a climate-controlled space at the university's engineering history department that Alessandro had arranged through a colleague who chaired the mechanical engineering faculty. The room was not glamorous: industrial lighting, concrete floor, the faint institutional smell of a building that had been doing serious work for decades. A lift had been brought in. 4 experts were present besides Ethan and Alessandro: Thomas Bennett, a powertrain historian from Osaka, named Kenji Watanabe, who had flown in specifically for this, a metallurgical specialist from a university laboratory 2 states over, and a documentation authenticator who had spent 30 years verifying the provenance of significant industrial artifacts, and who approached the task with the professional skepticism of someone whose value depended on never being fooled. They worked for 6 hours. Ethan stood to the side through most of it, answering questions when asked, producing documents when requested, and otherwise staying out of the way. This was not his performance. It was, in a sense, his father's, the engine and the paperwork together constituting James Mercer's account of something he had done and never spoken about publicly, now being read aloud for the first time by people who had the vocabulary to understand it. He watched Kenji Watanabe spend 40 minutes on the combustion chamber geometry, measuring with the careful attention of someone reading a manuscript in a language they'd spent years learning. Watanabe had published 2 papers on the P-76 program, both of which Ethan had read years ago. He watched the man move through the engine the way you moved through something you'd studied at a distance and were now encountering in full dimension, and he recognized the expression on his face because he'd worn it himself. At 14, standing in his father's garage looking at an engine he didn't yet have the knowledge to understand. The metallurgical specialist took samples from 2 locations on the block, non-destructively, using methods Ethan had approved in advance. Those samples would be analyzed for alloy composition and compared against available records of materials used by the manufacturer in the early 1970s. The results would take 3 weeks. Everyone in the room already knew what those results would confirm, but the process demanded rigor, and rigor was how you turned a finding into a record. The documentation authenticator spent 2 hours with the papers from the archival box and the sealed envelopes. He handled everything with cotton gloves and examined each item under a portable light source, checking paper composition, ink oxidation, the specific properties of typeface and handwriting that indicated period origin versus retrospective fabrication. He asked Ethan 3 questions over the course of those 2 hours. At the end, he removed his gloves, set them on the table, and said to Alessandro, in the flat tone of professional confirmation, "The documentation is consistent with the stated period of origin. I see no indicators of alteration or fabrication." Alessandro, who was sitting in a chair he'd brought from across the room because his knees required sitting more than they used to, nodded once. Thomas was looking at Ethan when this happened. Ethan was looking at the engine on the lift, and his expression was the one he always had, which was not quite readable from the outside. But Thomas had spent enough time with him now to recognize that what was underneath the stillness was not indifference. It was a very old feeling that had finally found its proper context, the feeling of something completed. At the end of the 6 hours, the 5 experts gathered near the lift and spoke in the way that people spoke when they were building consensus out of what they'd individually found. There was some technical discussion that lasted 20 minutes and that Ethan followed precisely. Then Alessandro stood up from his chair, using the cane with the irritation of someone who still hadn't accepted that he needed it, and turned to Ethan. "The engine is genuine," he said. "It was not the kind of statement you dressed up. A confirmed example of the P-76 program. 3rd confirmed build unit, based on the assembly notation sequence. Operational, complete, unmolested." He paused. There is nothing else like this anywhere in the world that we know of. Kenji Watanabe said something in Japanese. Ethan understood it. It was not a technical statement. It was the kind of thing people said when they had been looking for something for a long time and had found it. A sentence that was more breath than words. Ethan said, quietly, in Japanese, "My father would have been glad you're here." Watanabe looked at him. He was a precise, compact man in his late 50s who held his emotions in the same way many engineers did. Close, organized, not on display. But something moved across his face when Ethan said that. He bowed slightly. Ethan returned it. Thomas watched all of this from across the room and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. The formal report from the examination was published in January in the journal Alessandro's Foundation maintained for significant historical findings. It ran to 22 pages. The section on James Mercer's role in the program was 6 paragraphs, which was not long, but which was more than had ever appeared in any published record, and which named him correctly and described his contribution with the precision it deserved. Ethan had reviewed the draft of those 6 paragraphs 4 times. He'd made 2 small corrections of fact and no changes to the characterization, because the characterization was right. The report generated coverage in the automotive press and in 2 general interest publications. It was smaller coverage than Heartfelt had produced, more technical, less emotionally available to a general audience. But it was the kind of coverage that lasted. Academic work had a different half-life than news. The Heartfelt piece had already begun to fade in the general consciousness, the way news pieces did, replaced by the next thing. The journal report would be cited for decades. Ethan read the report when the advance copy arrived by email. He read it at his kitchen table, which was where he read most things, with coffee that went cold the way his coffee always went cold, because he read slowly and with full attention. He read the 6 paragraphs about his father 3 times. Then he closed the laptop and sat in the quiet of his kitchen for a while, listening to the house settle around him, and thought about what it felt like to have kept a promise you'd made to someone who was no longer there to see you keep it. It felt like most things that mattered, not triumphant exactly, more like solid, like something that had been load-bearing finally showing that it could hold the weight. He called his brother Marcus that evening. "I saw the thing in the news," Marcus said, which was how Marcus engaged with most things Ethan did. At a slight distance, with affection and without full comprehension. "Chloe has been telling everyone at school that her uncle owns the most famous car in the world. I don't know if that's accurate." "It's not accurate." "Well, she's 9, close enough." A pause. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm okay. Do you need anything?" "No, I just wanted to call." There was a brief silence, the comfortable kind between people who didn't talk every week, but knew the texture of each other well enough that silence wasn't uncomfortable. Then Marcus said, "Dad would have been," and stopped. "I know," Ethan said. "I mean, he really would have." "I know, Marcus." "Okay." A pause. "Chloe wants to know if you'll bring the car to her school for show and tell." Despite everything, Ethan laughed. It was a short, genuine laugh, the kind that surprised you. "Tell her no." "I'll tell her maybe." She negotiates. "What?" Vanessa came back to the storage unit one more time in January on a Saturday when the cold was serious and the gravel lot was half frozen in a way that made every step deliberate. She'd emailed first, the way she did now, and Ethan had written back with the same minimal confirmation he always gave. She brought coffee this time. 2 cups. In a carrier from a place near the highway exit she'd stopped at on the way. She held one out when she got out of the car, and he took it, and they stood in the open unit doorway with the Datsun behind them and the frozen lot in front of them and drank their coffee without speaking for a moment, which would have seemed impossible to her 4 months ago and now felt almost natural. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told him. "About evidence. About proof that work happened. What about it? I've been thinking about how much of what I do is designed to be seen, to be visibly legible, as successful, as valuable, as important, and I think I've confused the legibility for the thing itself. For a long time." He didn't respond immediately. She'd noticed he didn't feel silence the way most people did, and she'd started to appreciate it, because it meant that when he did respond, he was responding to what she'd actually said. "Legibility has uses," he said finally. "It's not wrong. You run a firm. People need to be able to read you." "But I applied it everywhere. To a man parked on the street. I read the surface and thought I understood the depth. Yes, he said. Just that. Not letting her off the hook, but not piling on either. She looked at the car. She'd been looking at it differently since November, not as an object, but as an argument. An argument for a way of existing in the world that she hadn't considered seriously before, where the standard of the work was the point and everything else was secondary to that, including whether anyone else could see it. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. Did you ever feel like you were waiting too long? Like the car was just sitting there and the world didn't know, and some part of you wanted to say something? He thought about that. She noticed he always thought about things before he said them, which was also unusual. Once, he said, when I was in my 30s, I had a conversation with a collector at an event, someone I respected, and he made an offhand comment about my father, not knowing who he was. He said something about how the great craftsmen of that era were mostly European, and the few who weren't were institutional names attached to institutional programs. He paused, and I was standing there knowing what I knew, and part of me wanted to say, my father spent 3 years in a room with the people who built the foundation your entire career is standing on, and nobody outside of a very small circle has ever heard his name. But you didn't say it. No. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because proving it in that moment, to that person, in that conversation, wasn't the point. The point was having the proof, keeping it intact, making sure that when the time came to tell the story was real and complete and couldn't be questioned. He looked at the car. My father didn't build that engine so I could use it in arguments. He built it because it was the work. The story was always going to come eventually. I just had to keep it ready. Vanessa held her coffee cup with both hands against the cold and looked at the Datsun and thought about the relationship between patience and certainty and how she'd always treated them as opposites. Patience being what you practiced when you lacked certainty, and certainty being what eliminated the need for patience. She had spent 20 years being certain, moving fast, making reads and acting on them before anyone else finished processing. And it had worked. Most of the time it had worked, but there was a version of certainty she hadn't understood until now, which was the kind that didn't need to announce itself. The kind that was so settled it could afford to wait. She wasn't sure she'd ever had that kind. She wasn't sure she was capable of it, but she was starting to understand what it looked like from the outside, which was at least the beginning of something. I've changed some things at work, she said. He glanced at her, not with particular interest, but with the attentiveness he gave to things when he was genuinely listening. The way we evaluate potential investments. We've always had a heavy weighting on visible metrics, market position, public profile, leadership legibility. I've introduced some additional criteria around depth, around what's actually under the surface. She paused. It sounds like a small thing when you say it out loud. It's not a small thing, he said. Changing the criteria changes everything downstream. My team thought I'd lost my mind initially. Did they say so? Rachel did, not in those words, but she has a way of raising an eyebrow that covers a lot of ground. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent. She's direct. She is. It's why I've kept her around as long as I have, even though half the time she makes me uncomfortable. Vanessa looked at the frozen gravel. She told me when all of this started that I should write the email to you myself, that she wasn't going to draft it for me. Good advice. The best advice I got. She paused. She's also been quietly researching independent appraisal as a field. She hasn't said anything to me about it directly, but I know what her research patterns look like, and she's been spending time in that direction. He absorbed this without comment. I think you made an impression, Vanessa said. People make their own decisions about what they're interested in. Sure, but sometimes they need to see something real before they know what they're interested in. She looked at him. You were the real thing, in a place and a moment where she needed to encounter it. He didn't respond to that, which she'd come to understand meant he was holding it rather than deflecting it. They stood in the doorway a while longer, finishing their coffee. The cold was steady, and the gravel lot was empty except for their 2 cars, and the Datsun sat in its unit with the patient, in different presence it always had. The presence of an object that had been somewhere for a long time and was not in any hurry about what happened next. I'm not going to be a different person because of this, Vanessa said. It was not a defensive statement. It was something closer to honesty. I don't think people change at the fundamental level, really. I think they get corrected. I think they hit something that adjusts the angle slightly, and if they pay attention, the adjustment holds. That's probably right, he said. You don't think people change? I think change is mostly a word we use for sustained correction, he said. Same direction, over enough time. She thought about that. She found that she agreed with it, which surprised her slightly, because it was more optimistic than it sounded. Sustained correction over enough time was still movement. It was still the trajectory shifting. You didn't have to call it transformation for it to matter. Thank you, she said, for the meetings, for letting me come here. You needed to see the car, he said simply. I understand that. She nodded. She looked one more time at the Datsun. The rust, the dent, the tape on the mirror that had never been replaced, and probably never would be. She looked at it the way you looked at something you wanted to remember accurately, not the polished version, but the actual one, with all its wear and all its history fully visible. Then she got in her car and drove back to the city. Rachel didn't announce her decision. She made it the way she'd noticed most genuine decisions were made, not in a single moment, but in an accumulation of smaller moments that eventually amounted to a direction you could no longer pretend you weren't moving in. She'd been researching automotive appraisal and provenance documentation since November. She'd started with her father's library, which was extensive, and which he'd offered without being asked, seeming to understand what she was doing before she fully understood it herself. She'd moved into academic literature, into professional association materials, into the specific technical knowledge base that the work required. She was starting from a foundation. Her father's decades of proximity had given her more than she'd realized, but the foundation needed a great deal of building on. She called her father on a Sunday in February. I'm thinking about going back to school, she said. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was not surprised. Mechanical engineering history? Or the appraisal certification route? The certification route first, then we'll see. That'll take 2 years if you're working at the same time. I know. And you'd need mentored hours. I know that too. He was quiet again, and this time the quality of the silence was different. She'd heard this particular silence from him before, the one that came when he was deciding something that mattered. I could supervise the mentored hours, he said. If you wanted. My hands aren't good anymore, but my eyes and my knowledge are perfectly fine. She hadn't expected to feel that particular feeling when he said it. The specific combination of gratitude and recognition that came when someone offered you something real without framing it as a gift. Yeah, she said, keeping her voice steady. I'd want that. Then that's settled. A pause. Have you told Vanessa? Not yet. I'm not leaving immediately. I want to give her enough time to find someone. She won't find someone like you. She'll find someone competent. That's all she needs. Thomas made a sound that was not quite a laugh. You've changed, Rachel. I've been corrected, she said. There's a difference. She told Vanessa on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 days before she'd planned to, because Vanessa asked her directly what was going on, and Rachel had stopped being able to look at that question and deflect it. Vanessa listened to the full explanation. Then she said, Your father's library and mentorship, Ethan Mercer's example, my firm's sidewalk being the location of the inciting incident. She said this without self-pity and without humor, just as a reading of the facts. That's quite a sequence. It is, Rachel agreed. How long have you known? Since around November. I wasn't certain until January. Vanessa nodded slowly. She looked out the window for a moment, at the city in the gray March morning, at the street below where the whole thing had started on an ordinary day several months ago. I'm not going to pretend I'm not losing someone I'll have a hard time replacing, she said, but I'm not going to tell you not to go. I know you're not. How long do I have? As long as you need to find someone reasonable, within reason. Vanessa almost smiled. 3 months. 3 months, Rachel agreed. There was a pause, the kind between two people who have been through something together that wasn't on the job description. Then Vanessa said, Tell your father I appreciate what he's done. For me, inadvertently. Through you. You could tell him yourself. He'd take a call from you. Vanessa considered this. Maybe I will. She looked at Rachel. Is Ethan Mercer taking on apprentices, do you think? Rachel looked at her. Why? The mentored hours. You said your father can supervise knowledge, but he can't do fieldwork anymore. Actual examination hours, hands-on assessment. You'd need someone who's still active. Rachel hadn't gotten to that part of the planning yet. She absorbed it now, with the feeling of a problem she'd been about to encounter suddenly becoming visible in time to think about it. I don't know if he takes apprentices, she said. Ask him, Vanessa said. The worst outcome is he says no. She emailed Ethan that evening. Not about the apprenticeship immediately. She told him first that she was leaving Pinnacle, that she was pursuing appraisal certification, that her father had agreed to supervise the knowledge component. She told him because she felt he was owed the context, not as a request for anything. The second paragraph was the question. She framed it carefully because she'd learned that precision mattered with him, not implying entitlement, not making it smaller than it was, just asking plainly whether he had any interest in providing supervised examination hours to someone at the beginning of the process, understanding that she came with a foundation, but not the practical experience. His reply came the following morning, 2 paragraphs which was longer than usual. Rachel, that's a good decision. The field needs people who came to it through real interest rather than convenience, and the foundation you have from your father is substantial. The certification route is the right sequence. I don't take apprentices as a rule, but I've worked with people who are serious about learning, and the difference between an apprentice and someone you're working alongside is mostly about attitude. If you're interested in being in the room on examinations over the next year, with the understanding that you're there to observe and assist and ask questions after rather than during, I'm open to discussing it. Your father should be present for the early sessions, partly for the mentorship requirement, and partly because I'd like his read on a vehicle I'm examining in April that has some unusual documentation. Come with him. We'll see how it goes. Rachel read that email twice and then sent it to her father with one line. Read the second paragraph. He called her 10 minutes later. She could hear in his voice the specific happiness of a man who was going back to something he'd loved and missed. April, he said. What vehicle? I don't know yet. I'm going to guess it's the 1972 Skyline variant that's been circulating in the Eastern Collector Network. Alessandro mentioned it to me in December. You and Alessandro still talk? We have lunch when he's in the country. We've been doing that for 15 years. A pause. He talks about Ethan a great deal now. He says he's the most naturally gifted appraiser he's encountered in 40 years. He says it the way he says things he's already decided are facts, without qualification. Rachel sat at her kitchen table in the early evening and thought about the chain of it. The sidewalk, the photograph, the email, the second visit, the gravel lot, Hartfield, the formal examination, the journal report. Each thing following from the previous one with the logic of consequence, which was not the same as inevitability. At any point the chain could have broken. Any person could have made a different choice. But they hadn't. And the chain had led here. Her father going back to work he loved, her moving toward work she was genuinely built for, and Ethan Mercer agreeing to let them into his process in the careful, conditional, entirely unsentimental way he agreed to most things. Dad, she said, yes. Thank you for coming with me that first time, to the storage unit. You found him, he said. I just confirmed what you'd already seen. I didn't know what I'd seen. No, but you knew it was worth looking at. That's the part that can't be taught. The Datsun stayed in the storage unit through the winter and into the spring, which was where it lived most of the time. Ethan drove it occasionally, on days when the weather was right and the roads were clear, and he felt like covering some miles in something that handled the way it handled and sounded the way it sounded. He drove it the way his father had driven it, with both hands on the wheel and the window cracked 2 inches, and the attention of someone who understood that the machine under them had a particular character that demanded a particular kind of presence. He drove it in April on a Saturday when the temperature had finally come up enough to justify it, out along the county roads east of town where the traffic was sparse, and the road curved through low hills, and the engine note changed in the curves in the way it had always changed. He drove it for an hour and a half, not going anywhere specific, just covering ground the way you covered ground when the covering was the point. He thought about his father on those drives. Not deliberately, not as a practice, James Mercer simply arrived when the engine was running and the road was unfolding, and there was nothing between Ethan and the specific sensation of the machine his father had worked on in a workshop 40 years ago in a country across the ocean. The car was not a memorial. It was not a shrine. It was a car, and his father had been a man, and the man was gone, and the car was here. And the connection between those two facts was not grief exactly. Grief had run its proper course years ago. But something quieter and more durable, something that did not require a name. He pulled over at an overlook east of town, a turnout in the road where you could see the valley laid out below and the hills going pale green in the early spring. He left the engine idling, which he did sometimes when he wanted to listen to it, and he looked out at the valley and thought about the letter from Carol Morey, which he'd read several times over the winter and kept in the archival box with the other documents. She had written back a second time in December, after the journal report was published. She had read the 6 paragraphs about her father and about James Mercer, and she had written to say that her father had told her, near the end, that the 3 years of that program were the most fully engaged he had ever been in his engineering life, and that the collaboration with the American craftsmen had been part of why, that there was a specific quality of attention James Mercer brought to the work that had made the work better, that had required everyone else in the room to be fully present because he was fully present. She had written, "My father said the best engineers he worked with were the ones who cared about what they were building more than they cared about what the building would prove about them. He said your father was the most complete example of this quality he ever encountered in the field." Ethan had read that sentence perhaps a dozen times over the winter months. He had not responded to it with anything in particular, not in the letter, where he'd said something brief and genuine about what it meant to hear it, and not internally, where it had simply settled into the layer of things he carried that were too important to speak about often. The engine idled. The valley spread out below in the early spring light, going green in the hesitant way of things that are returning after a long absence. He sat in the seat his father had sat in and looked at a view his father had never seen, in a life his father had not lived to see unfold. There was a particular kind of inheritance that didn't announce itself. You didn't receive it at a reading of a will or in a conversation where someone sat you down and said, "Here is what I'm leaving you." You received it the way you received most things that shaped you. Gradually, through proximity and attention, through the accumulated weight of watching someone do something the right way until the right way became the only way you could imagine doing it. James Mercer had not told his son to become an appraiser. He had not told him to keep the car indefinitely, to decline all offers, to wait for the moment when the world was ready to understand what was under the hood. He had taught him, by example and repetition, and the specific quality of his attention, what work looked like when it was done with integrity. He had taught him to recognize it and honor it, and to carry it forward in whatever form that took. The form it had taken was a particular kind of life. Not large, not conspicuous, not designed for other people's quick comprehension, but genuine and durable. And it had turned out the kind of life that arrived at the right moment because it had been patiently building toward the right moment all along without making a project of it. He put the car in gear and pulled back onto the road. Vanessa Sterling changed the intake criteria at Pinnacle Capital Partners, and it held, which she had not been entirely certain it would. In the first year under the revised framework, her team identified 2 investments that would have been bypassed under the old weighting. One, a small manufacturing firm whose market profile was negligible, but whose process engineering was exceptional, and one, a materials science startup with no public presence but a technical foundation that a more surface-aware read would have missed entirely. Both performed well. The manufacturing firm in particular was, 18 months later, producing returns that her more visible investments were not matching. She told no one the origin of the change in methodology. Not because she was ashamed of it, she had moved past shame about Heartfelt into something more useful, but because she was done performing the lessons she was learning. She was trying, with uneven success and genuine effort, to be the person who had simply learned them. The distinction was not always clear from the outside. She suspected that was fine. She did call Thomas Bennett in April. They had lunch. His suggestion, a restaurant near his house that served good food without requiring a reservation, which he said was his primary criterion for restaurants now that he was retired. He was as she'd expected him to be, warm without being easy, precise about what he knew and clear about what he didn't, the kind of man who had earned his confidence through the right means and wore it lightly because of that. They talked for 2 hours. She asked him questions she'd wanted to ask since November and hadn't had the right context for. He answered them with the generosity of someone who liked questions asked in genuine good faith. Near the end of lunch, she said, "How do you know when you're looking at something real? When it's an exceptional piece versus something well presented?" He thought about it. You look at what it did when nobody was watching, how it held up under conditions where there was no incentive to perform. He picked up his coffee cup. The best vehicles I've ever authenticated were the ones that weren't trying to be anything. They just were what they were. All the evidence of that was right there, if you knew how to look for it. She held that for a moment. That's not just about cars. No, he said. It rarely is. The car remained where it had always been, in Ethan's care and in the storage unit at the edge of town where the gravel turned to frozen mud in winter, and then back to gravel in spring, in the body it had always had, with the rust and the dent and the tape on the mirror and the engine under the hood that had never needed to announce itself because it had always simply been exactly what it was. The Japanese Automotive Heritage Foundation's offer for a long-term exhibition loan was still on the table. Ethan had told them he was thinking about it, which was true. He had conditions. The car would be exhibited in context, meaning the story of the program and the craftsman who built it would accompany it. James Mercer's name would appear beside Alessandro's documentation and Takeshi Mori's engineering legacy in whatever material the exhibition produced. The car was not the point by itself. The car was evidence of the work, and the work was the point. And the work had names attached to it, and those names deserved to travel with it wherever it went. He hadn't decided yet. He was still thinking, which was how he made decisions that mattered. He would think until the thinking produced a direction he could commit to cleanly, and then he would commit to it, and in the meantime the car sat in the unit and he drove it on good Saturdays and checked the engine with the attention he'd been applying to it since he was old enough to understand what he was looking at. Chloe came to see it in May when her parents brought her out for a weekend visit. She was 10 now, which she felt strongly was meaningfully different from 9, and she'd been doing a school project on automotive history that she'd chosen herself, which Ethan suspected had a number of influences he was only partially responsible for. She stood in the unit doorway looking at the Datsun with the focused attention she brought to things that interested her. "Is it true it's worth millions of dollars?" she asked. "That's what people say." "But you're not going to sell it." "No." She considered the car for a moment. "Because of Grandpa." "Because it's his work," Ethan said. "The money's about how rare it is. What it actually is, that's not about money." She nodded, in the way she nodded when she was filing something for later, rather than fully processing it now. She walked around it, looking at the dent and the tape and the rust with the same direct inventory she applied to most things. She stopped at the hood. "Can I see the engine?" He reached in and pulled the release. She stood over the engine for a long time, longer than he'd expected. He watched her looking at it, the way she'd looked at her water cycle project before the science fair. Seriously, without performing her interest, just actually looking. "It doesn't look like anything special," she said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." "But it is." "Yes." She was quiet for another moment. Then, "Is that the whole thing? Like, is that the point? That it doesn't look like it, but it is?" He looked at his niece standing over his father's engine in the gray light of a storage unit, asking a question that was more accurate than most adults would have managed. He thought about sidewalks and gravel lots and coffee in the cold and letters from daughters of engineers and the accumulation of all the moments between a 14-year-old boy looking at something he didn't yet understand and a man who had spent his whole adult life building the understanding. "Yeah," he said. "That's pretty much the whole thing." She nodded. She looked at the engine one more time. Then she looked at him. "Grandpa was good at his job." "He was the best I ever knew," Ethan said, "and I know what I'm talking about." She accepted that with the seriousness it deserved, and they stood together in the open doorway with the spring air coming in from outside, and the engine sat between them in the morning light, patient and permanent and entirely itself. Some things did not need the world to see them to be real. They had only ever needed to be done well, and passed on carefully, and understood finally by the people who had earned the understanding. That was enough. It had always been enough.